We are fortunate to have with us Father Malachi Martin, and we are going to be discussing about the situation in the church today. And perhaps, Father, you can start off by telling us just a little bit about yourself and what you're doing now and what some of your background is.
Yes, Bernard, of course. I was born in Ireland 68 years ago. I joined the Jesuits, and eventually, after the usual training of 17 years, passing through various European countries and universities, I ended up in Rome as a professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. I was trained as a paleographer. Most of our listeners don't know what that is. It's somebody who studies handwriting, and my expertise was in Middle Eastern handwriting about the time of Abraham. But that became a very useful profession for the then Pope John the 23rd, because he needed contacts with both Arabs and Jews, and I traveled extensively in that area, the Middle East, and therefore I was useful to him. And I got very closely associated with John the 23rd and a certain cardinal called Cardinal Augustine Bayer. He was the man who was in charge of ecumenism and who traveled extensively in the States during the council. But before that time, I had asked my superiors for permission to leave the Jesuits, and in 1964, Paul VI, who was then Pope, granted me the permission. He gave me permission to leave the Society of Jesus, and he secularized me. That is, I didn't want to be a laicized. I wanted to be secularized. That is, I didn't want to be under a bishop incarnated in a diocese. I didn't want to belong to a religious order. I didn't want to join Opus Dei. The only three alternatives for a clergyman, for a priest, in the Catholic Church. So he granted me that and gave me a general commission to write and to be active in the field of communications about the Church. And then I went from there to the United States, passing through Paris, and I arrived here in just 25 years ago, in January 1965. And from then on I've been writing books and been very engaged in radio and television. I think I'm known as probably as a conservative. We love tags in the United States. Some people would call me a traditionalist. But Bernard, I'm a Catholic. I'm a Catholic priest. And I say my Mass every morning. And when permitted by the local bishop, I engage in the usual priestly activities. But my main activity is writing and confessional work and pastoral care of people who, today, in the condition of the Church, don't find pastoral care available, especially families who are at sixes and sevens about what is happening to them and their children and the public weal. That's a brief history. My books sell well. I've had 3 or 4 bestsellers, and that's due to the grace of God and not to anything I've written.
Could you please tell us a bit about a few of the books you've written that have sold fairly well? The most commonly spoken about one is The Jesuits.
That's right. It was, because it was the first book published which, in cameo, outlined what had happened in the major orders of the Church. In brief, between 1965 and 1975, the major orders in the Church, Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, Carmelites, literally turned their backs on the papacy and proceeded to follow a line about the Church and about the mission of salvation of the Church, which is at variance with the traditional Catholic view of life and death and resurrection. I did merely a cameo study of the Jesuits, and immediately it was applied to all the other orders. They began to realize that something was extremely rotten in the state of Denmark, that if the Jesuits could have gone like that, and they did go like that, then they could explain the vagaries of the Franciscans and the horrible corruption of the Dominican order. And all these orders had been the bastions of the Church for centuries. And you know, it's a terrible reflection I have, Bernard, that today, what John Paul II needs at the present moment, like he needs air to breathe, he needs a body of men, highly trained, specialists all, in every possible department and sector of human life. He needs them internationally established at all the choke points of civilization: Africa, Asia, America, North and South, Canada, the Soviet Union, old Europe, Western Europe and Central Europe and Scandinavia. He needs them highly centralized. He needs them utterly obedient to the voice of Peter. He needs them utterly devoted to Our Lady and her Lord. He needs them as priests. And that was the Jesuits. That's exactly what Ignatius has in mind. And today, they are not there any longer. physically in the sense that they're going down in numbers. You know, there are less than 1,000 Jesuits in the United States today. I think in 1965 there were 8,500. And every third man in the missions was a Jesuit. But it's not merely numerically. It is the quality. They literally have declared a silent war on the papacy.
Which is an exact reversal of their fourth vow, which is loyalty to the papacy.
Obedience. Obedience. Blind obedience was the keynote. And that is why they were so valuable to the Pope, even to the point of permitting him to kill them off in the 18th century for the good of the Church, and then to revive them about 70 years later because he found he needed them. But that was perfect obedience. That's gone. So the Jesuits did create a stir and earned a lot of hatred for me and misunderstanding, except from the older Jesuits and from some of the younger Jesuits who realized that the truth was being told. Now, that was a very good selling book in the sense that it did a lot of good. It did an awful lot of good. It did open up what we call in the States a can of worms. It did show what happened. And the fact was I had Jesuits writing me privately, anonymously, with money to cover 50 copies to be sent to an anonymous address, a P.O.B. box somewhere, because they didn't dare show the book in public. The other book which created a lot of stir was a book called Hostage to the Devil, published in 1975, and it's the only published record of 5 exorcisms of living Americans. It was based on video and audio tapes because I have been very active in exorcism all my life. It was a bestseller here and abroad, and it still is. What it does is this. It proves that any man or woman over 50 who doesn't realize that out in those streets and in those boardrooms and in the boudoirs and in the corporate headquarters and in the army headquarters and the government chancelleries, who doesn't realize that Satan is alive and active and happy, that man or woman is a jackass.
That is a very difficult concept for the modern mind to grasp, because one of the first teachings of the Church that is being sort of pushed aside by modern theologians has been a belief in Satan, the devil, and hell.
That's right. It's the best PR job ever done. He doesn't exist. He doesn't exist. But please do this. Please kill the babies before they're born. Please establish a third way of life. It's human rights. Homosexuals have the same rights as heterosexuals. Please make homosexual marriage all right. Please use these contraceptives, because then you'll benefit all mankind. We'll limit the population. It doesn't really matter if the people in East Timor are being killed off by the Indonesians. It doesn't hurt us. He's everywhere. He is everywhere, producing this demand for reason and tolerance and non-fanatic outlook. And every man is his own law, and every conscience is his own guide. This is the best PR going. But the devil, the old figure with horns and a dirty tail and yellow eyes and dirty books under his arm, hiding behind the bushes and saying, "Come over and I'll show you some sin." Oh no, that's myth and superstition. It always was. This is an angelic intelligence, far more potent than any human intelligence could ever be. It's an archangelic intelligence, and it is engaged in a life-to-death battle with one man, who's God, Jesus.
We've got ourselves into a state of affairs, I think, both in the world and the Church, where the devil is active and well. And we'll be discussing this situation later on. But to understand how we got there, we have to go back in time to the days of before the Second Vatican Council, when at least everything appeared to be all right in the Church. Among conservative people, there is some debate about, is that period in the Church of the 1950s, let's say before the Second Vatican Council, was it a very positive period, or was it a negative period, or what is a bit of both? What are, let's say, some of your reflections on that period of history, just shortly before the Second Vatican Council?
Well, we can take this, Bernard, we can take this from a purely what they call historical point of view today, which is the secularist point of view. And you can say, well, there was this teacher who was a bit wonky in his theology, and there was this movement in the 30s about the liturgy, which the Pope had to suppress. But, you know, if you'll allow me, I think we should get an overview of this, first of all.
Well, why don't we do that?
The overview was given by the one person, apart from Jesus Christ, who could give it to us, and that was the Blessed Virgin Mary. She did appear 6 times in 1917. And the last time was October 13, 1917, to 3 children and to 75,000 people. There was a miracle, the miracle of Fatima, at noontime at Fatima in Portugal. Fatima is a small little hamlet, 75 miles from Lisbon, the capital of Portugal. Let's not delay for the moment. We can go back to it later on, the miracle of the sun, because it's the paramount miracle of the 20th century, perhaps the 5 centuries. But she did convey 3 secrets to those children and told them not to publish them yet, but to convey them to the local bishop. And one of those secrets has become the famous 3rd secret. Now that 3rd secret was conveyed or written on one sheet of paper to the Pope finally in the 1950s, about 1954 to 1957. The dates are always discussed by people. We know now the general lines of that secret. In fact, we know details. But the one outstanding thing was, Our Lady said that the Pope of 1960 had to open the envelope and read this secret and then do what she said. And the secret apparently, on the authority of the Pope, on the authority of Cardinal Ratzinger, on the authority of many people, said the following. It was an either-or. It was an ultimatum. The world is gone so far, by this time, the secret said, that unless Russia is converted by being consecrated to my Immaculate Heart, then faith will disappear from nations and continents. Cardinals and bishops and priests will fall like leaves into hell. In other words, it was an either-or. But if the Pope, in union with the bishops of the Church, in 1960, consecrates Russia, just Russia, the Soviet Union, the USSR, to my Immaculate Heart, then Russia will be converted and faith will be restored. Well, the sad aftermath of this is this, that Pope John XXIII, whom I knew, did open the secret. And he opened it privately, first of all, in Castel Gandolfo in August 1959. And then in 1960, he opened it in the presence of several cardinals. Cardinal Bea was there, my cardinal, and with 2 Portuguese interpreters. And reading it and finding out that he was supposed to publicly, in union with all the bishops, and they were gathering into Rome, by the way, 2 years later, he was supposed to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary and declare it to be a source of evil, but would be converted. He decided that Nikita Khrushchev, who was the strong man in Russia at that time, would take this as an act of war. Now, do you know, you may not know, that under Nikita Khrushchev, between 1958 and 1963, the most virulent anti-religious persecution took place in the Soviet Union.
It's interesting. I do have family in Russia. And what a lot of people don't know is that the persecution under Khrushchev was even more severe than that of Stalin.
Much more severe, much more severe. Well, so John said, I can't do that. I can't, because Nikita Khrushchev then would stop talking to me. At that time he was talking to John because John had one dream. He wanted observers from the Russian Orthodox Church to be present at his council. So at that meeting of cardinals, he took a sheet of paper and wrote on it, Questo, meaning the letter, non è per nostri tempi, is not for our times. Put it back in the box of the letter and closed it. He refused the mandate of Our Lady for his own good geopolitical reasons. I think it was short-sighted, and above all, I think he disobeyed Our Lady. But I'm a simple priest, I'm not Pope. That's my judgment. When Paul VI came in, he read the letter and decided to do nothing about it. John Paul I read the letter, but he had only 34 days to live. John Paul II read the letter at the beginning of his pontificate in 78, October 78, and put it aside, and he only took it up again in 1981 when he lay in Gemelli Hospital, wounded. And then he suddenly realized that indeed Our Lady had saved him on May 13 from the bullets of Mehemet Ali Agha, the assassin. And he sent again for the letter and all the documents, and Lucia, Sister Lucia's writings. She's the only surviving child. And then he sent a message over to the Bishop of Leiria and to Lucia asking their advice about one point. And then in 1984, he consecrated the entire world.
Which is not what Our Lady asked for.
No. He made a special mention of Russia, saying the peoples, meaning the Russians, who still await their special consecration. In other words, the consecration hasn't been done. The point I'm making to you, Bernard, is that Our Lady's either or is in action. She said, unless this is done, unless it's made public to all nations and all governments, all peoples, then faith will disappear from nations and continents. There will be huge catastrophes. Many people will die. But in the end, my Immaculate Heart will save people. So, if you want an overview of what's happened, take it like this. How come, or take an image, I think it was in 1966, suddenly all electric power disappeared from the northeast corner of the United States. The reservoir filled with juice, as we say in the United States, suddenly was emptied. Nobody has as yet explained how it all disappeared like that. Similarly, if you look at the church, between 1965 and 1975, suddenly Catholicity disappeared. Suddenly. Priests left, nuns left, suddenly bizarre ceremonies took place, suddenly every practice like devotion to the Sacred Heart, to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, confraternities, sodalities, St. Vincent de Paul work, pilgrimages, benedictions of the Blessed Sacrament, the habit of visiting the Blessed Sacrament, children's first Holy Communion, marriage, abortion, contraception, homosexuality, everything was turned upside down. Suddenly, the reservoir of Catholicism suddenly was sucked out, disappeared. And the only theological way you can look at that, theology, not historical, in the secular sense, is that God withdrew grace. God withdrew grace, sanctifying grace, without which you can't be Catholic. That's the overall view of what happened. And that's why Pope John Paul II in Fulda in 1980, when confronted with very fervent German Catholics, they said, Holy Father, why don't you renew the church? He said, I can't. Renewal is impossible until Our Lady comes. He was quoting the echo of that letter. And then he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out his rosary and said, that's your only weapon, the rosary. Pray, pray, and do nothing else but pray. So his mind from the very beginning was made up. I cannot renew my church. It can't be renewed because renewal is only possible through grace. You can't do it by organization. You can't do it by any human means. That is his attitude, and that's the explanation of it. Now, on the other hand, if you descend into details, you will find that, for instance, the big surrender on the part of the church. By the way, Bernard, when I say the church, I'm always talking about churchmen. There are two things to be distinguished. The church essentially is the mystical body of Jesus. What is that? The words people toss out. What does it mean? It means this, that there is a body, there is a group of people on earth and in heaven who are in the state of grace. And being in the state of grace, that is the church without spot or wrinkle. That belongs to Jesus completely. There is a body of people in purgatory who are being purged and cleansed by grace. And they also belong to the mystical body. That's the church suffering, the church militant, and the church triumphant. That's the church, essentially. It has a visible organization, an institutional organization called Roman Catholicism, based in Rome, the first bishop of Rome, the Pope, and then consisting of dioceses run by bishops, all of whom are supposed to be subject to the Pope, to obey the Petrine authority of the keys of St. Peter.
And we will be using the term church in line with the institutional church.
That's right. Whenever we speak about the church, we're talking about the institutional organization, not that pure and holy body of people. Nowadays, of course, the numbers who really belong there, that's another question. Nobody can say. But we can go back to that question at another moment in this talk. Now, the church itself, if you examine its progress, say since 1930, you'll find that the seedbed of all the errors that have plagued the church and do plague the church today began then. They began then. Now the biggest plague, the biggest triumph of Satan is the destruction of the Mass. Because without the Mass, without valid priests saying valid Masses, being ordained validly by validly ordained consecrated bishops, we have no Mass, we have no Blessed Sacrament, the presence of Jesus is wiped out.
Let's go back here now to the reign of Pius XII.
Yes.
He put out an encyclical called Mediator Dei.
1946.
Yes. So this liturgical movement must have been active long before the Novus Ordo Mass was introduced.
In the 1930s, it was. And in that Mediator Dei, as you've known, but let's remind our listeners, he actually says, and there are some people who want to take away the tabernacle from the altar. He listed all the
They want to take away black vestments.
That's right. That's right. They want the place to face the people. But why did he do that? Because in Belgium and France and Germany of the 30s, there was a movement, a liturgical movement, mainly started by Benedictines, but also supported by the Jesuits, which proposed all these things, proposed people masses. And when it came to the Vatican Council itself, as you know, the last vote in the Council in 1965 concerned the Mass. And the bishops were absolutely categorical. They said, do not wipe out the Latin, keep the Latin Mass, but translate the popular parts, meaning the Credo, the Gloria, the prayer before Mass, the Introibo Mass, prayers as we call them, and the communion prayers at the end. Put those in the popular language. But the canon stands. This was the Council. And I remember that a bishop who had visited Paul VI just after the end of the Council in December 1965 came in to me here in New York and said, you know, Malachi, the most extraordinary thing happened to me. I was speaking with the Pope, His Holiness, 2 days ago. And I congratulated him on the vote in the Council. And he said, don't speak to me about the vote. Don't congratulate me. There are already 18 new canons in vogue in France. They've gone haywire. They've already translated into vernacular. And the thing is not valid anymore. And I have no control over it. So what happened? Well, there was a character called Bugnini, Annibale Bugnini, who was a Freemason, member of the Lodge, who set as his goal to create a new ceremony in the Catholic Church. He has this in his articles published in the Italian Revista, which could be accepted by anybody, Catholic or non-Catholic or non-Christian.
So it's an ecumenical religion, and because Bugnini was a Freemason, one wonders if he was doing this in the long run to lead towards the creation of a one-world religion.
Of course he was. Of course he was. The difficulty is that he wasn't alone. He had powerful friends. And by the way, just as a footnote, you know that the official canon of the Mass now, the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, was composed by 6 Protestant clergymen and 2 Catholic clergymen. I mean, how bastardized can you become? No matter how pious and good these men were, they're not Catholics. They didn't know the Catholic tradition. But anyway, let's go on. What we have to acknowledge too is that there was a very carefully laid out integrated plan to make sure that no statement of the Vatican Council, if possible, couldn't be ambivalent. And I remember Cardinal Bea coming to see me once in my room in Rome, and this was 1962, sweating. And the Council had just begun, it was November 1962. And I asked him why he was disturbed. He said, because I've just heard an awful remark by Hans Küng. He was talking to, and he named an American theologian, who is now a bishop, who shall remain unnamed. And he said, Küng, in answer to a question by this man, I didn't hear the question, said, oh, no. This time we're not going to leave. We're not going to have another Reformation. We're staying inside this time. Which gives an eye-opener on what the plan was. And the plan was simply to make sure that the traditional Romanist Catholic traits of the Church would be wiped out. The result is that if you examine all the documents of the Vatican Council, there are 15 main ones, you'll find that except for something like the Mass, what it says about the Mass, the old Mass, the Roman Mass, as I always call it. I refuse the name Tridentine even, because Trent did not invent this Mass. It was the old Roman Mass celebrated by Pope Damasus in the 5th century. The idea was to make sure that no statement of the council would stand that could not be interpreted ambivalently. For instance, nuns must modernize their dress. It's quite clear from the discussions in the council at that time, they meant, well, get rid of things which are really a hindrance, say, in a subway, or a hindrance simply out of place. They certainly didn't mean nuns to walk around with pearl necklaces and lipstick and powder and hot pants and hot dresses, and to sit in cocktails in large hotels having their annual conventions. They meant nuns to have a garb, a religious garb, a sign of their devotion to the spouse they had married by their vows.
What seems to have happened is a complete revolution, because for a nun to go from heavily garbed into lipstick and watching television and miniskirts, it's a total turnaround.
It was destruction. It was destruction. Not only that, but there were a whole, as you know, in California, there was a whole set of schools that simply, all the nuns simply left the order, left the church. But that was carefully done in the Vatican Council. Everything was left ambivalently. The main thing that was left ambivalent was religious liberty and the idea of communism. As you know, 500 fathers asked Paul VI to allow them to condemn communism. They were forbidden. That was one of the agreements that John III made with Nikita Khrushchev. That was one of the things that haunts us today.
Let's talk about this Rome-Moscow agreement. What is this Rome-Moscow agreement?
Well, the Rome-Moscow agreement is very simple. John III did feel that if he could get 2 Russian observers in Rome for the council, that it would be Pentecostal. Nikita Khrushchev knew well the power of propaganda and the voice of the church. And already the satellite countries were in trouble, and Russia was in trouble too. So he said, provided there's no condemnation of Marxism by the church or of the USSR, and he had several other things besides that, but that was the main thing, then I will grant permission for 2 observers. The negotiations were carried on by Cardinal Tisserand, a French cardinal, in the house of the Bishop of de Smet. He was a French bishop in Metz, in the city of Metz. And they were concluded satisfactorily, and the two observers arrived. The Rome-Moscow agreement therefore meant that there was an unofficial line between the Vatican and the Kremlin from then on. That had been established, by the way, during the war by a man called Monsignore Giovanni Battista Montini, behind Pius XII's back. And Pius XII was utterly enraged when he found it. It was one of the reasons why finally he expelled Montini and made him Archbishop of Milano. And then for later on, after his death, he became, as you know, Paul VI. And another man who was very active at that time in the Vatican State Department was Agostino Casaroli.
We know a lot about him.
Yes. He's the Secretary of State. And he gathered around him an entire band of people who are very anti-American, very anti-Anglo-Saxon. And it's not that they want to become communists. They just believe that the pie can be carved up differently. And they never got very far until John Paul II came in with his personal charisma and made it possible for us to have this interview with Gorbachev. But that's a completely different question, what is happening now under John Paul II. The trend in the Vatican was to allow the Marxist idea to pervade Christianity, which emerged, as you know, in liberation theology in Latin America, and was never suppressed, even though John Paul II has made more than 3 trips to Latin America to suppress it. And that was the Rome-Moscow Pact, and it's still in vogue. It's still in vogue. And Rome has not gone back on it. Vatican diplomacy is such that once a mistake has been made, it generally tries to live with it. It rarely tries to obliterate the mistake. Rarely does. So it has lived with this all during the reign of Paul VI, and there were contacts. All the bully boys of the satellite nations went to see Paul VI in the 70s, and President Podgorny, Nikolai Podgorny, way back in 1967, I think, came to the Vatican to see him, and Paul VI used to receive this famous man, Metropolitan Nikojin, who was the go-between. He was the Metropolitan Bishop of Leningrad and Ladoga, second highest ranking bishop in the Soviet Union. It was he who negotiated with Tito on this Moscow Pact, and it was he who died in the arms of John Paul I, as you know.
Do you think that the Russian Orthodox Church, led by Nikodem, is very much a puppet church?
absolutely a puppet church. It's as one Russian said to me, it is deviled. I can't translate the Russian word in any other way. He said, we have been servants of the devil for so long, we have forgotten what we are. And if you want to measure the amount of devilment in the Russian Orthodox Church as an organization, think of the following fact, that nobody can be of any prominence in the Russian Orthodox Church unless he's a member of the KGB. Nikodym himself was a colonel in the KGB. He was tortured 11 times by the KGB. They thought he was turning tail on them, which he finally did.
What do Catholics behind the Iron Curtain think about the Rome-Moscow Agreement?
First of all, let's be clear on the condition of Catholics behind the Iron Curtain. Contrary to what a lot of people would like to think, the condition of youth and the condition of the church behind the Iron Curtain is almost worse than the condition of the church in the United States and Europe. Almost worse. But there are solid bodies of believers who have clung on, mainly in the Ukraine, by the way, where you have 4 to 5 million Ukrainians who literally have been having Mass in forest glades and behind rocks, much as the Irish had for 400 years during the British occupation of Ireland. Now, they have regarded all contact with the Soviet Union as abhorrent, because they lived with the commissars. They felt the whips. They were sent to the Gulag. They lost their priests and bishops and nuns and churches and convents. They regarded it as blasphemy. They couldn't understand it, and they don't understand it, because they had lived with the demon called Marxism under Stalin and Nikita Khrushchev, and under Mr. Gorbachev, and under all the intermediary figures. They know the truth about everything. They have no illusions whatever. And if you talk with people like Cardinal Tomaszek of Prague, who's now free to say his Mass over the television, you'll find that his eyes film over when you question him about the goodness and the wisdom of the Rome-Moscow Pact. They regard themselves as having been delivered lock, stock, and barrel into the hands of the Soviets. Because they say, if at any given moment Rome had flung its full weight publicly, against the Soviet Union, as Pius XII tried to, but at that stage he was almost 80 and physically too weak and psychologically broken down. And already the tentacles were spreading into the Vatican. The tentacles of what they call the Superforce, which is now within the Vatican bureaucracy itself. If the Church had done that, if the prestige it had coming out after the Second World War, the prestige was huge in America and in Canada and in Latin America. No doubt about it, it could have curbed what Stalin was doing. It could have curbed Nikita Khrushchev. It could have made a difference. We didn't do it. We compromised. One small example, I'll tell you. Paul VI got all the bishops of Vietnam assembled in Saigon and sent over a special emissary, a cardinal whose name begins Pignedoli, to tell them to advocate surrender and peace with North Vietnam. Total surrender. Why did he do that? He did that because he had been influenced by Metropolitan Nikodym, who brought a message from the North Vietnamese through Moscow that the North Vietnamese wanted peace, and they needed 6 months to prepare themselves. This was in 1968. In 1968, the United States had leveled North Vietnam. They had no hope of winning. So Lyndon Johnson was faced with the request from Paul VI that he not bomb any more, that he not do any more war destruction. He wait until spring. And what happened in spring or February? The Tet Offensive. They had rearmed and they came back like a lion. And from then on it was downhill for the United States. But in the meantime, Paul VI got his bishops to vote for peace against any furtherance of war, any resistance. And that is called compromise. And compromise was the message. Compromise, sacrifice, wait. Which is not the action of a militant church conscious of its own strength. It was compromise. And the result was that Mindszenty, for instance, was hauled out of the legation in Budapest, where he had been for 15 years, promised that nobody would be made cardinal in his lifetime, put in a seminary in Vienna, and immediately they appointed a new man, Lecoy, who was a Marxist. He's dead now, the cardinal. But he was an open Marxist. There was compromise all over the place. That was the result of the Moscow Pact. And the result was that when the Latin Americans in the late 70s started with their liberation theology. And we say, well, the church has a pacific approach to all this, and obviously you can Christianize Marxism. Well, what happened was they Marxized Christianity, because liberation theology is merely Marxism with a Christian faith. Christ becomes the revolutionary. Mary is the mother of all the revolutionaries. The bread of life is no longer in the tabernacle. The bread of life is now what we manufacture in our factory, which no longer belongs to the...
It's a materialistic ideology, then.
But in Christian terminology. That's the point.
Ah, so it's Marxism with a Christian veneer, then.
That's right. If you attended any of the meeting of the basic communities, Comunidades de Base in Latin America, of which there are 600,000 now, they trample on the cross. They say this castrates the people. Jesus was a revolutionary. He was killed because he was against the witch. And they use all the words about Jesus leading them, I am the way, the truth, and the life, take up the cross of war. This is Marxism.
They have turned the truth upside down, because one of Christ's basic messages was that his message and his kingdom was not of this world.
Of course, of course. But they have made it now, and that's why Paul VI made the error too in his own way, misguidedly, declaring that now we will work with man for a better world. But this is not the mission of the church. And that's where John Paul II has never erred. He knows exactly what salvation means. Now, it is very clever of Marxism because, as you know, what it did in Latin America is it penetrated Christian culture. And that is why, say, Nicaragua had the support of the Jesuits and Carmelites and Dominicans and Franciscans. And in Latin Central America, it is rare to find a priest who is not Marxized in his priesthood, in his so-called pastoral care. And while the Jesuits in Managua ran a school for Marxist tactics.
Let's take a look, though, at the situation here in the United States and in my country, in Canada. The bishops put out these statements from time to time on defense and economics. Are Marxists behind those statements? Because there seems to be a lot of left-wing terminology in these.
Marxization is. They have been Marxized. The essence of Marxism is this. Well, let's get quite clear between us. The essence of Marxism is this. Don't look beyond the human horizon. You, man, are capable of infinite perfectibility, providing that you get the capitalist jackals off your back. The people, they're the source of power. They're the source of perfection and of happiness. Don't look to anything transcendent. Everything is immanent to you. All your powers are there, but you've just been hindered by the rich and the oppressive capitalist lackings. That's the essence of Marxism. The rest of it, the workers' paradise, the proletarian revolution, those are all historic accretions which can be changed, as Gorbachev has, to other phraseology, to reasonableness and tolerance and lack of fanaticism. But the essence is, I want you to look at this world only. Don't expect salvation from on high. There's no message from beyond the stars. There's no salvation out there. Jesus is a man. We are men. That's the essence of Marxism. Now, the bishops in this country and in your country and in Europe, concentrating exclusively on sociological and political and military questions like nuclear disarmament, and on the environment, and on AIDS, and condoms, let me use that awful word, of which nobody knows the origin, and everything else, are purely and simply acting as social engineers. There is no pastoral care. There is, for instance, I read with horror the pastoral letter of Cardinal Mahoney of Los Angeles on the Blessed Eucharist. I assure you, it could be read by the Dalai Lama and accepted. It is totally and simply a sociological document. And apart from other blotches on Cardinal Mahoney's behavior, like absolving people from any obligation to go to Mass on Monday after Christmas Day, because they won't go anyway, he said. Some of the stuff like writing to him and saying, listen, we want to commit adultery tomorrow, would you please absolve us because we're going to do it anyway. This is not Catholicity. This is an imminent, this world attitude to make do with the social conditions that there are. Women want to be priests, why not? They have their rights. I want to be a homosexual, why not? It's your right. It's another lifestyle, because it's all immanent. You can make it happen. This is the essence of Marxism. We have been penetrated.
Could it be then that the common thread that what has happened since the Second Vatican Council is that the Church has been secularized, that humanism has replaced Catholicity.
It has, but the key to that is just one person, one intelligence, Satan, Lucifer. He has successfully sold a bill of goods to the majority of Catholic bishops, namely that their job now is to align the Catholic people with the movement of peoples towards human perfection in a very interdependent society of nations. That is what they've been sold. And they will not do anything that violates that. And that's why you can safely describe our bench of bishops in this country, there are about 300 of them, as the religious arm of the left wing of the Democratic Party. It toes the line, right down the line.
And it seems that they're spineless, like on the issue of abortion and various other liberalizations that have occurred since the 1960s on divorce or what have you. They have been totally spineless in opposing those movements.
Totally. And the compromises they made were terribly embarrassing. Now, because, for instance, when Governor Cuomo of this state, New York, came out in favor of abortion funding, and he procures abortions by financing them, there was no condemnation. He's a public figure. Now, from the very beginning, you should have made it clear. Anybody who votes for abortion funding procures abortions, in other words, just as sure as the surgeon procures the abortion, or the wife who submits to abortion, or the husband who pays for it. Anybody who does is excommunicated, can't receive the sacraments. He can go to Mass, or he or she can go to Mass, but until they confess it and repent in public, they can't receive the sacraments. That should have been applied holus bolus from the very beginning. It wasn't. So when Bishop Maher of San Diego excommunicated or declared that the candidate for election, I forget her name, Killaire or something like that in California, on account of her abortion behavior, or favoring of abortion, could not receive the sacraments, everybody howled at him. How dare you interfere with the political rights? From the very beginning they should have made it clear, this is not a question of political rights, this is religion, this is our stand. They didn't. They didn't. You know, one main failure there, this is the theme we should, I think, hit upon further, is this. When Jesus left us, visibly, he didn't give us armies, didn't promise empires. He promised we'd be hated, by the way. He promised the world would always be against us. But he said, you have one thing, you have a spiritual weapon, my grace. The one thing the bishops have not used is their spiritual weapon, the grace at their disposal. Let me give you an example. Recently here, in the last 4 weeks, St. Patrick's Cathedral was desecrated by the homosexual organizations. They invaded it, they interrupted the Mass, they broke the host into pieces and threw it on the ground. They were insulting, and they had placards which were blasphemous. Cardinal John O'Connor purified the church canonically. But he never once decided to use the spiritual weapon of consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. What he should have done, what many advised, was that he consecrate the homosexual community of New York to Our Lady of the Immaculate Heart, asking for grace they be converted. Because the only power we have is that grace. They haven't used that grace. They have not used that grace. They have not used the spiritual weapon. And therefore the spiritual weapon is lying dormant. And we are at 6s and 7s. We don't know what to think. We're just hurt. And we want to be Americans. And we want to be like everybody else. And we want to be at peace with everybody.
Catholics have joined the world, in other words.
That's right. That's right. That's the bill of goods for the soul. You've got to be part of it. Otherwise, why be fanatic? You're not American, you're not Canadian, you're not good citizens. You've got to be part of it. That's the bill of goods that's been sold by one archangelic intelligence. Now, when Lucia was speaking with Our Lady in one of her visions, there was a very poignant moment when Our Lady said to her, look, my child, don't be surprised if at a certain moment a certain diabolical disorientation affects the best of minds, a disequilibrium, so that they no longer judge according to the voice of my son and of Peter. And you know, when you regard the way the bishops are acted, and the way priests act, and the way theologians act, and the way the best sometimes make awful errors, talking out of two sides of their mouth, you realize that there is a disorientation. They no longer know what it is to be Catholic. They no longer know, they no longer have the Catholic instinct. And why it's safe to say that we no longer have a Catholic people. What we have is this, we have one-on-one groups who are still Catholic. And amongst my associates in the United States and abroad, the first question we ask about anybody who looms up on the horizon for the first time with an appointment or a book or whatever, we say, is he Catholic? And we don't mean has he been baptized. We mean, is he still of the faith? Does he believe? Does he practice what he believes? Does he live it out? Does he say the rosary? Does he go to Mass? Does he go to confession? Does he uphold the Petrine authority? Because that is the crux, Petrine authority. That is the aim of the entire revolt of the bishops, to get rid of the Petrine authority. And it's almost got rid of in practice, as you know.
It looks like that there's really only pockets of Catholicism left throughout the world.
Just pockets, just pockets. And anybody who doesn't realize that by now has his head stuck in the sand. Because the church has now been blanketed. You see, it's very easy in the church. It's composed of an organization of dioceses and parishes. And the pipeline into that comes from Rome, through the bishop. The bishops have occupied all the choke points of that pipeline. And they have piped into it a new structure. The Novus Ordo, the RCIA, if you people in Canada have experienced the RCIA.
What is that?
That is the new way of Christian initiation. And if you read the manuals, baptism in another form, you'll find out that it's full of the most amazing amalgam of naturalism, environmental love, a bit of voodoo, some witchcraft, some Wicca, as we call it in this country, W-I-C-C-A, some Protestant traits, but absent is genuine Catholicism. And then we have, in addition to RCIA, we have a thing called Renew, which is a form of renewal, they call it. And it means chiefly that the idea of a priest offering the Mass is out, that the people now have the power, that they decide what prayers to say, and they decide what their approach to sin is. This has been piped into schools and parishes so that it has blanketed the Catholic Church in the United States and abroad, has changed people without them knowing they've been changed. They've been led by Pied Pipers out of the church. You know, if you went around England in 1530 and said to anybody, are you Catholic? They said, of course I'm Catholic. By 1630, several men had worked on them. And if you went around in 1630 and said, are you Catholic? They said, of course I am. But at that time, they no longer had Mass. They no longer had any obedience to the Pope. They no longer recited the Credo we always recited. They no longer had the virtues. They were into Protestantism, but they did not know it. They were Anglicans. They no longer had valid priests. They no longer had valid sacraments, confession, baptism, holy orders, anointing of the sick. That was all gone, and they didn't know it. Similarly with the Mass of the Catholic people, they don't know. They don't. How could they know?
The institution is still there.
That's right. It's a grand illusion. We have cardinals and bishops and priests and nuns and convents and monasteries and printing presses and Catholic libraries and Catholic colleges and Catholic books. But it's an illusion.
So it's a facade.
It's a facade, behind which there is nothing that would be even permitted by past popes or the past churchmen. Wouldn't be permitted. Wouldn't be simply allowed. They'd kick you out of your ear.
Let's go back to Pope Pius XII on this point. Did he foresee that something like this was going to happen?
Yes, that's why he refused to have a general council. He refused anything like that, and why he was insistent on two or three things. No truck with Marxism. No even talking with Marxism. Utter separation and waiting and blocking them. And why he tried to set up an underground church in Russia itself. And he had 5 bishops and 7 apostolic administrators in Stalin's Russia until they were betrayed. A man came down once, said he was a Russian Orthodox, entered a Roman seminary, was trained, was ordained, and went back to Russia. He was a Russian spy, with all the names. And overnight, everything disappeared. They were all taken and killed. That liquidated Pius XII's attempt to have an underground in the Soviet Union. But that was one point he stressed, Marxism. Another point he stressed was Our Lady. He stressed this devotion of Lady. It finally became a sort of a joke amongst the bishops who were already losing their faith, that you couldn't get near him unless you were saying the Rosary. But by that time, the work of the devil had started, and devotion was diminishing. Besides that, then, it became very, very voguish in Europe and the United States for the religious orders to send their men to secular universities. The plea was, if they go to secular universities, they will know what the other side are saying, as if you couldn't read it in their books and listen to it in their lectures. The result was they turned out a generation, my generation, of thinkers, theologians, bishops later, cardinals later, who had absorbed secularist ideas and who had all their friends and careers and honorableness linked with a world which was totally anti-Catholic. And that was part of the seeding for Vatican II. Now, that was the first thing those two things that Pius XII hit. The third thing he hit very hard, but always just touching it because he hadn't read the third secret, was the coming destruction of the church and of civilization. It's a note you find in creeping into his public sermons and addresses and in some of his letters, because he had got communications from Lucia, Sister Lucia, the surviving child of Fatima, and from others about what Our Lady had said was going to happen. But by the time he got to that, his main work was done. His main work was during the war. That was his main work, to resist Nazism, to resist Mussolini, and to tide the church over that period. That was, I think, what Providence called him for. After that, and then he did manage to keep Italy out of communism by organizing the Demo Cristiani, the Democratic Party in Italy. By 1950, when he defined the Assumption of Our Lady, which was one of his big acts, he was already in bad health. And from then on, he slid down a very slippery slope of very bad health. And finally, he succumbed in 1958. October, I think it was, 1958.
Let's take a look at John the 23rd. Was he a liberal, or was he simply naive?
He was a liberal. He was a very liberal. As you know, John was removed from teaching at the Lateran University because of modernism, way back in the beginning of his career. In fact, he could have ended there. He could have ended up as a parish priest in Bergamo, except he had friends in the propaganda, it was called that time propaganda fide, that is, the propagation of the faith, dissemination of the evangelical message. And they gave him a job, and then he went on to another job. And then they found he was very useful as a diplomat, because John was very calm and roly-poly, and obviously meant well, and as the French said about him, he was bon fourchette, he was a good fork, could eat a good hearty meal of pasta, he was great at children's communions, and he was very kind. He did save innumerable thousands of Jews in Hungary during the war, by issuing about 27,000 false baptismal certificates which were passed around and saved them. And in Bulgaria, the same thing. As you know, the Jews in Bulgaria, there were more Jews in Bulgaria at the end of the war than there were at the beginning, because of the activity of both the king of Bulgaria at that time and the archbishop, and Roncalli. And then he was very useful in Paris after the war with de Gaulle, because de Gaulle couldn't dislike this man. And the Vatican's big problem in France after the war was that many bishops had supported the Vichy, the pro-German faction in France, and they were condemned to death in principle. So John maneuvered the church out of that difficulty. Then he was made Patriarch of Venice as a reward, and nobody expected him to become Pope. But in 1958, he was the only man they could light upon, because the cardinals were in disarray about what to do about the church at that time. Yes, he was a liberal. And in addition to that, he was theologically ignorant, extremely ignorant. He had the garden of the soul variety of devotionalism. If you read his Diary of a Soul, it's very simple, simplistic almost. He was wily, as a peasant is. He came from peasants who had been fighting with the elements and land and animals for hundreds of years. He was monoglot, really. He spoke French, but he was Italian and monoglot. He spoke one language. And above all, he had an illusion that if he managed to get as many different people as possible, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, communists, Hindus, Buddhists, into his Vatican Council, there would be a new Pentecost. The Holy Ghost would actually enlighten everybody with a new flaming deluge of tongues, and the world would be one again in love and faith in Christ.
So he was chasing an illusion.
Absolutely, chasing an illusion. Then he was also, he also had another view completely of Europe and Marxism. He was capable of the poor, and therefore he did think the imbalance between poor and rich should be corrected. That, of course, was taken by his Marxist collaborators as a way of pushing him towards a compromise with Nikita Khrushchev. No, John was a liberal, and unfortunately his piety was not sufficient to give him perception. He did go to Fatima as a cardinal, and he did want to be known as the Pope of Fatima, and he did institute a feast day of Our Lady of Fatima. But when it came to the Fatima revelations and the mandate of Our Lady, because it directly, head-to-head on, went against his Ostpolitik, his policy of reconciliation with the Soviet Union, he would have none of it.
And therefore he said, this is not for our time. And the question one would have loved to have asked him is, why didn't Our Lady tell us that? If she says, in 1960 the Pope must open this and publicize it to all the nations of the world, nobody wouldn't dare ask him that.
Before John the 23rd died, did he realize that something was starting to go wrong?
Yes, he did. Insofar as his carcinoma allowed him, because from March on, John was in a very bad condition, March 1963. He died on June 3, and in a horrible agony of hours of horrible pain. But he used to say at the end, it's no longer non è il mio concilio, this is no longer my council. After the first session, he knew that the anti-force had taken over. Because, as you know, in his preparation for the council, he had a preparatory commission, and they prepared what they called schemata, that is, documents, which would be discussed by the bishops in council. They'd modify it, change it, adapt it to their individual needs and the needs of the Church Universal, and then stamp it with their signature.
Archbishop Lefebvre was on this council, wasn't he?
He was. Archbishop Lefebvre was. What happened was, in the first session, they simply said, we don't want these documents. We've got to have new documents. And the new documents were exactly tailored to that blessed ambivalence they wanted. And from then on, he knew the council was going down. Physically then, you see, the carcinoma was eating away at his vitals, and he was already over 80. And he simply physically hadn't the strength. And apparently, he hadn't got the grace, or Christ didn't want him to do anything. Because over all this burnout, over all this mess, this disintegration of the Catholic Church in its institutional organization, and the infidelity of priests and nuns and cardinals and bishops, and the connivance, say, amongst European cardinals against John Paul II, and amongst American cardinals against John Paul II at the present moment. Overall, you must say to yourself, this has been permitted by Christ. He is, after all powerful. He could change all hearts. He hasn't. He has allowed it go like that. So this is permitted by Christ, not willed. It's something you must reflect on. We must all reflect on that he has allowed it. He has allowed this victory of Satan, because it is a victory, a marvelous victory. It's a terrible victory for us, but for him it's a superb victory. He has successfully infiltrated the church in its highest levels, right up to the throne of Peter. So we must say that about John 23rd, that he wasn't given the grace to see where the errors he made. And Paul VI wasn't given the errors to correct his weakness. He was a great pope in other ways, but he could not correct them. Why? He didn't get the grace. That's the most charitable thing we can say. Let God judge him. As you know, poor Paul VI went around Castel Gandolfo in his last days, shuffling, because he had terribly swollen legs with phlebitis, besides his lungs were giving out. And all they could hear him say, when he didn't think anybody was with him, were breve conversation, little stretches from the credo. Credo in unum Deum, credo in ecclesiam catholica, credo in unum Deum, credo in Christum Dominum, as if to assure himself on the verge of eternity, and that it all held still intact.
He seemed to be somewhat helpless as a pope.
Totally helpless. He was already coddled and swaddled in the folds of the super force installed in the Vatican, and he could do nothing about it, just as John Paul II can't. The only thing is that John Paul II, coming from a distant land, being a fighter, having his own geopolitical point of view, has decided on an end game. He's going to double right around it, he says, and thinks and plans. He is not Paul VI, he's not Italian, and he's not John 23rd, he has no illusions. This man has no illusions at all.
What is his game plan? Or what was his game plan when he came to office in 1978?
Geopolitical. That is, he accepted the fact there was no possibility of renewal. No way he could scour out the church. No way he could reform the cardinals. No way he could clean out the Vatican bureaucracy. No way he could change the mass of the clergy in Latin America. No way he could save the Jesuits. He tried to suppress them. That was his intent originally, in removing the general of the Jesuits. And finally, he stopped even there. There was no point in any further attempt. But he did believe and does believe and holds firmly that he is the watchman on the wall waiting for Our Lady to come in the skies. It sounds fantastic. That is his belief. That will happen in his lifetime, and soon, not late. And we're now in the banner years of that. You know, a lot of people didn't understand, and didn't even take time to understand him in 1987. He established the Marian year. No, 1988, established the Marian year. He began in the middle of June and ended in August. And nobody said, why should have a Marian year, which was longer, 13 months, and which apparently went nowhere? He was preparing for Gorbachev and the present shake-up of the entire structure of the world, the Society of Nations. But that's another question.
And this is a topic which we will take up in our final tape on Inside the Vatican. This is the second in a series of interviews with Father Malachi Martin. is being recorded in his home in New York. Father, in this discussion, we're going to take a look at the situation from the perspective of the average layman in the pew. He's starting to realize that in many cases, in virtually all cases in fact, something is going wrong in the world, something is going wrong in the church. And we'll start right with his home and his family. And many parents are finding it very, very difficult to raise their children because there's all these influences on them that seem to be anti-Christian. Could you maybe comment on the difficulties that a family has in raising its children, and what are the sources of these difficulties?
Yes, it's worth talking about that, Bernard, because the mass of Catholics are laymen and laywomen with children and jobs and homes, and they live in certain areas, and they have to cope with the situation in their areas. And the universal experience in the West, forgetting for the moment the East in the sense of the former Soviet Empire or the Far East, but talking about the West, that is North America, South America, and Western Europe and Australia and New Zealand. It's the same story everywhere. From all the magazines and books that come out, it's quite obvious that nowadays it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, extremely difficult, requiring heroic virtue to rear your children and to yourself and your wife, or yourself and your husband, to behave in a way which formerly was regarded as normally Catholic. What has happened, and why is it so difficult? And is it going to change? And are you simply out of step? Should you be in step with the general march and stop worrying about things? Look, there are a few things we must comment on, first of all. The essence of Catholicism. You see, in my life, I have found non-Catholics, Greeks, Russians, Syrians, Protestants of all kinds, very pious and good. I mean, sometimes they were saints in my estimation. But missing was one Catholic ingredient. One typically Catholic ingredient. And if you don't find this ingredient, you haven't got Catholicism. It's this. If you examine the entire sweep of Catholic theology and pastoral care over the centuries, down to the middle of this century, you'll find that Catholicism meant many things. It's a rich storehouse, by the way, which we're neglecting nowadays. But it's a rich storehouse, but one note always came out. There is a thing called Catholic intimacy with the divine. What does it consist of? Oh, listen, apparently very simple things. It's prayer to the Blessed Virgin. It's devotion to the angels. It's novenas. It's the Blessed Sacrament being visited for 5 minutes to say hello, to console our Lord, to talk to him, to ask him about the problem of that mortgage, to talk about that child who's playing truant, to talk about your difficulties with your wife or your husband. Then it's benediction. It's the repetition of hymns. It's the constant flow of thoughts and devotions and recommendations from the Pope through the bishops to the people, and from the people through the bishops to the Pope, and pilgrimages. And it is this network of intimacy with all things belonging to heaven, because Catholicism set out to establish on earth a replica of what heaven is, so that you can have the food of angels every day, and you can assist at the supreme sacrifice of Jesus, and you can embrace his wounds every day in Holy Communion, and you can talk to Our Lady and get her help, and your boys can grow in the image of Christ, and your girls can grow in the image of Our Lady. And then there would be special people set aside, devoted to him, like priests and nuns and religious orders. And then there would be the occasional special event like a pilgrimage or a special mission. But it all centered on this uniquely Catholic trait of intimacy with the divine. We were allowed to have our conversation with heaven. As St. Paul says, our conversation is with heaven on this earth. Now, what normal people have found is that suddenly that is cut off. Suddenly they are expected to dialogue with each other. Suddenly they're expected to regard the priest as somebody the same as them. Suddenly they're supposed
to treat Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament as something very separate from their lives. Suddenly they're supposed to engage in sociological and environmental studies instead of studying anything about their faith. Suddenly they find that the rosary is no longer prominent and is not sold even in churches. Suddenly, in other words, everything is taken out from under them. They find their children coming home from school saying that, well, the Buddhists are very good, they're just as good as us, only they have different faiths. Then they find the bishops writing on purely sociological and anthropological questions and political questions, no longer have their stream of devotion and teaching about the life of Jesus, about hell, about heaven, about sin, about purgatory, about the truths of our faith. All this has suddenly gone. It's been cut off. That's the basic obstacle they find today. The result is that they find that what they thought was Catholicism is no longer Catholicism. They find that at Mass, they're not supposed to spend time in thanksgiving. They're supposed to sing hymns, which no longer are Catholic hymns. Sometimes they're hymns to nature. Sometimes they're poems about men and women. Sometimes they're quotations from Buddhism or Hindu books. And then they find that at Mass itself, there's no longer the devotion centralized on the altar. It is centralized on somebody dressed in leotard doing a dance. Or it's centralized in peculiar banners and in new forms of expression, even drawn from natural, say, events like storms and seas. They no longer have a spiritual vocabulary. Everything has changed suddenly. What did happen? What produced this? Well, if you see ever an overall phenomenon affecting millions of people, and there are millions of people in the two Americas and in Europe, and it is all stamped in one way and comes at you suddenly, comes at them all, you can be sure that it didn't happen by chance. In other words, we know now that this has been a concerted plan being put in action by an organized body of men. The difficulty is that since it is so universal, we know that it started at the top. It didn't start in one diocese. It didn't start in one country. It started in Rome. Because the church is so arranged that the pipeline from Rome flows into all dioceses. And we can track now through the various pontifical organizations and through the communications in those pontifical organizations, we can track the instructions and the directives given, so that overall in the church, in the West, in Europe, in the Americas, in Australia, in New Zealand, this message would go out loud and clear. This is the way you do it. This is how you conform. And it's a terrible situation because it has affected people in Rome. For instance, John Paul II did issue an indult called Ecclesia Dei, which says that we must, after all, take care of the sensibilities of people who want the old way of doing things. And therefore, we must have some measures that will take care of their wishes. Cardinal Meyer, who is in charge of this, recently has made it quite clear that this means that he will restore the Mass in certain places, and he won't restore it in other places. And when asked about it, he said, well, that's the meaning of the indult, that the bishops can do what they like. And this is a twisted view of what the Ecclesia Dei indult originally meant. It means that Cardinal Meyer is no longer free. It means that in Rome there is this super force that they cannot dislodge at their peril. And that has a hold of the teaching church. Recently, when the Pope appointed conservative bishops in Europe, 173 theologians signed a document, Germans and Belgians and French, saying the Pope had overstepped his authority. And nobody has said they hadn't been condemned. In 1984, when John Paul II wanted to make the Tridentine Mass, if you want to call it that, a rite on equal parity with the Novus Ordo, 4 cardinals flew to Rome. Basil Hume of Westminster, who is no longer Catholic in my estimation, that's my own personal opinion, Cardinal Lustiger of Paris, and 2 more flew to Rome and browbeat him into saying, you cannot sign this document. He didn't sign the document.
There seems to be a network which frustrates people like Cardinal Meyer, who are, let's say, trying to implement traditional forms of Catholicism.
That's right. There is a network which frustrates them. And the fact that they cannot do anything about it means it's powerful, means it has all the levers of power in its hand. And therefore, this is one of the reasons why John Paul II knows all renewal is impossible. He cannot do anything about it. He had to excommunicate Archbishop Lefebvre, instead of going himself to Econ and performing the ordinations, which was his original wish. He couldn't do that. He wouldn't be able to get back to Rome, probably. Because here's the essence of that organization, Bernard, and it's frightening. There is a large body of highly placed clergy, beginning with cardinals and going down as low as Monsignore and then into priests, who have one aim in life, and that is to make sure that any exercise of Petrine authority obsolesces and falls into desuetude. And de facto, they have brought church administration to the point that the Pope no longer exercises papal authority, except in a rare case when it's useful to them, the excommunication of Lefebvre. But otherwise, he doesn't exercise it. You see, there are two ways of my getting rid of you. You are with me in the company and you have a job. And I don't like you. I want to eliminate Bernard Jansen. Well, I can try and get you killed. I can try and get your job suppressed and you fired. Or I can arrange it so that your job becomes otiose, becomes pointless. You shuffle papers. You have no influence on company policy. You have nothing to do with the sales of our goods. You have nothing to do with the financial aggrandizement of the company. You sit in your office. You are useless. You have obsolesced. You're in desuetude. Your job is a cynosure. It means nothing. That is the aim of the present superforce, to make sure that the Petrine exercise of those keys ceases. And therefore, that it will be more or less like the ostrich feather fans they used to wave around the Pope when he was on the sedia gestatoria being carried in public. They're just relics of the past. Oh yes, we used to do that, but we don't do it any longer.
In other words, their goal is to make the Pope somewhat like the Queen of England, just a symbol.
Yes, but the ultimate aim is destroy Petrine authority. Destroy the unity of the Church around Peter. And that's the destruction of the Roman Church. That's the aim. And if you examine carefully the behavior of a thing like the Bernardine machine, as we call it in the United States, it's Cardinal Bernardine of Chicago who runs the bishops, the USCC and the NCCP, you'll find that it's always an endeavor to say, well, we Americans think this, we can't adopt the Roman point of view. And the French do the same, and the Spaniards are doing the same, and the Germans and the Belgians, and the Latin Americans are trying, some of them are trying to do the same thing. It's an effort to make sure the Pope does not exercise authority, because once he ceases to exercise it for a amount of time, it obsolesces. He doesn't do that. He has overstepped his authority, as the 173 signers of the Cologne Declaration said. You have no right to do this. You're Bishop of Rome. You administer that. Leave us alone. We can manage our own church in Germany, our own church in America. The Americanist church. That's the aim of it.
Let's take a look at what happened after the appointment of this East German bishop. After there was that protest, the next bishop to be appointed was Casper to the Diocese of Stuttgart.
Walter Casper has written several books. He's a prominent theologian. He's been in the Synod, the Roman Synod, several times. And from his books, it is extremely clear that Walter Casper no longer holds with the Magi coming to see Jesus, no longer holds with the Ascension. In fact, several truths of the faith that we've always believed that belong to Catholic intimacy with the divine no longer hold for Walter Casper. Why make him a bishop? Well, I suppose you could ask the same question about Bishop Lehmann, who in his book seems to lean in favor of the fact that St. Joseph was the natural father of Jesus. How can these men become bishops? Because the superpower is in charge. How does that work? It works like this. If you think, or if anybody thinks, the Pope decides to make Bernard Jansen Bishop of Strasbourg and writes a letter to Bernard saying, "You are now Bishop of Strasbourg, come and be all consecrated by me," then you have another thing coming. That is to pass through the bureaucracy-sodden and laden mechanisms of the Vatican, which is peopled with the superforce. All with their instructions, all with their anti-papal mentality, all with their point of view, ready to scotch things, ready to guide things, to push things at the bottom of the pile, to refuse an appointment, to make it impossible to do it. Bureaucratically, he cannot just sign a document. There are 5 or 6 signatures that go with it.
Do you think that in the Church, a lot of the power has passed from the hierarchy and into the bureaucracy, into the committees, into the chancery offices?
On the local level, yes. The bishop, the moment anything happens in a diocese nowadays, he sets up a committee. The committee makes its decisions for him. The bishops meeting in Washington at their annual meeting, they are handed the results of bureaucrats, the hidden little powers working in hidden offices whose names never appear. They give the bishops their decision. Most bishops are extremely ignorant of theology and sociology and politics. They just sign the documents because the rest of them are doing it. Nobody's going to rock the boat. On the diocesan level, that's true. In the Church Universal, it's in Rome. The choke points are and the blocks are. And there, John Paul II wouldn't live long enough to weed it out. He has no power to do that. It is just too strong. And I would think, too, that any really manly attempt to eviscerate the superforce in the Vatican would be met by his death.
Do you think that's what happened in the case of John Paul I?
It is a feasible supposition. But I have to cling to history in this matter. We don't know. And I also feel in the Catholic Church, once the Pope is dead, that's that. It would be nice to know. It's titillating the imagination. It's horrific for the imagination to find out the truth about these things. But the Pope is dead. Long live the Pope. We now have another Pope. And what happened to John Paul I is hidden in the bosom of God. We'll find out in eternity, or we may find out even in time. There have been attempts to say one thing or say the other. Nobody can establish it as of yet, and I wouldn't try and establish it. I'd be afraid for my own kneecaps.
Let's go back now to these committees and the chancery offices that make up these religious programs.
And new rules.
Renew and new rules, let's say with granting of annulments. Are they thinking of the laity at all? Or are they chasing some illusion? Or what are they, because
no.
The laity have never asked for this stuff.
These are no longer Catholics in the Roman Catholic sense. They have another religion. But you and I have to admit and face the fact that there is a thing called neo-Catholicism, which lacks any instinct for Catholic intimacy with the divine, which repudiates all Roman control by the Roman Pope, which doesn't see the Pope as the universal bishop of the Church. It sees the Church as a collection of believers who are now engaged in marching with their fellow man towards the utopia that's going to be brought about by the New World Order. They belong to that, and they don't think they share all the views of man's liberty to pick his sexual lifestyle. They share all the views of modern man about changing his partner like a shirt that's worn. They share all the views of man about whether it's killer whales or the snail darter or the environment or euthanasia. They share all those views. They say we must modernize, become part of men because we're building a new world, the New World Order.
So they're chasing an illusion.
Of course they're chasing an illusion.
Let's look again at this New World Order. Could you say a bit about this?
Well, the New World Order depends on two things which are paramount today, which nobody can escape from. Number one, there's no such thing as an independent nation today. Gorbachev found that out. We're all interdependent. In what sense? We must trade. If you don't trade today, you're dead. Or you're reduced to the status of the pygmies in the Kalahari Desert. There's interdependence, number one. Secondly, there's this. Every nation wants development. What is development today? Development is hospitals, roads, supermarkets, VCRs, all the electronic paraphernalia of communications. It is freedom to travel. It is freedom to choose your marriage, to break it and make another one, to choose your sexual lifestyle. That is development. And it means that you submit to the requirements and the rules of technology, according to technology develops better way to have better people, hygienically, socially, physically, sexually, medically. That is the idea of development today. That's development. Now, those two forces, mainly being pushed by the entrepreneur, the banker, the transnationalist corporation man, are purely natural. They're materialistic. They're as bad as Marxism, only much more subtle. Because they don't kill you. They swaddle you in pleasant things. And they make sure that you needn't have a deformed child. And they make sure that you needn't live with a partner that finally has grown cold for you. And they make sure that you need never think. Just look at the boob tube. And they make sure that your idea of goodness is reduced to the common denominator of behaving in such a way that you smell nice, and that you eat well, and that you don't kill your neighbor. And that's a reduction to the absurd of the human ideal within a universe where finally your money and your flag and your sexuality and your food and your reading material and your entertainment is all determined by corporate masses of people. That's development.
And how has this New World Order affected the education system?
It has completely infiltrated the educational system. The education system in the States, in the United States, I'm sure in Canada the same thing, is now a system of secularizing the mind of the people. It no longer takes past history and past philosophy and past religion and translates them into language of today. It is totally new. And hence we find the young people coming out of school today don't know anything before their birthday. They know nothing about it. They don't want to. They're so fascinated by the new world rising in front of them, the electronically geared world, the world of instant satisfaction, the world of new curious developments, of extraordinary sounds and sights in outer space and within the world. Education has been reduced to that, and things that mattered humanistically, like poetry and drama and literature, all that is by the way, is a relic of the past, is in books. We don't read books anymore. Reading is not our forte. We listen and we look, and somebody else decides what we're listening to and what we're looking at. And the result is education, if it's any good, is technological. You're a good engineer, you're a good surgeon, but the spirit, the soul, is gone out of it all.
And that is a very scary thing to think about.
It is a very scary thing because it has affected medicine, it's affected social life, it's affected family life. It means that if I'm going to be Catholic, if I'm going to have my children living in Catholic intimacy, where am I going to start it from? Because we are no longer surrounded by Catholic institutions that breed that speak about that develop that mirror that. We now have Catholic institutions in every parish, in every diocese, which mirror the new desire for the New World Order based on this development of the whole man and on my being successful, my being beautiful, my being happy, my being clean, my being hygienic. This now is the great difference.
Well, it seems to me that the parochial schools, both in the United States and Canada, seem to be just extensions of this New World Order.
They have been effective. There's no such thing as a Catholic school in the normal sense of the word nowadays. By exception, yes, you find the odd one, but it's very odd. And that's why many people are turning to homeschooling, and why they want alternative, the voucher system, where they can put their children anywhere and not pay for the public schools too, also, which are sinks of iniquity as regards Catholicism in the rearing of children. But that's the difficulty, that they no longer have the Catholic institutions. They have been infiltrated. And whether it's the bishop or the parish priest or the nuns, there no longer is that Catholic separateness. The idea is to do away with all divisiveness. Don't be fanatic about this. Be one of us. Be modern.
So it's trying to meld the church into the one world order.
That's right. The difficulty is that it can't succeed. It can't succeed. It can go a certain distance. It can destroy, and has destroyed, a lot of the Catholic structure. It has produced this grand illusion of the Catholic institution existing when it no longer exists. But it can't succeed because it's materialistic, and it's just as bad as Marxism in its own way. And Our Lady has said that this is going down the hill. This is going to produce catastrophes in which whole nations will disappear, whole sections of continents will disappear, until she comes, and by the grace of God, and by her intercession, and by the indulgence of her Son, saves what is left. It can't succeed. That is the difficulty. And that's a very frightening thought.
And the families, they don't seem to find this Catholic intimacy either in the parishes. Because you go to, let's say, visit the Blessed Sacrament now, you're going to run into all kinds of problems. Yes, the church door will probably be locked, and if it's open, the Blessed Sacrament is not pushed off to the side.
It's not there, or it's not there at all. It's either in the sacristy or something else. And then you look at the church, there's no inspiration in it. Statues are disappearing, and the Stations of the Cross. Who does the Stations of the Cross nowadays? I mean, what an extraordinary idea to go around 14 times and stand in front of pictures and genuflect and pray. It's not done any longer. That intimacy with our Lord's sufferings, with his wounds and his hands and his feet and his side and his head and face, hey, nobody thinks about that. It's not nice. It's not nice any longer. It's not human. It's not humanistic. It's not beautiful.
And you walk into any modern church, and the crucifix, if it's there, is usually the resurrected crucifix. They don't want to portray any suffering at all.
Suffering is out, because that's barbarous, and that's primitive, and it's no longer beautiful, no longer, it disturbs. Why should I be disturbed because somebody is suffering? Why should I see blood coming from a waxen hand on the cross, or look at eyes that are tortured, or the head pierced with thorns? That's uncomfortable. It's not a nice thought to have, and it's bloody-minded, it's primitive. This is the modern point of view, and that's why the confessional is the same thing. I mean, if you go to confession nowadays in many churches, if you find confession regularly, which is very difficult, you find that it's a chat between you and the priest. Sometimes he'll walk you in the garden and talk to you about it. It's a friendly chat between people. Originally, it was you went to a priest to be absolved from your sins. Nowadays, the belief is the priest doesn't do any absolution. You're sorry for your sins, and he agrees with you and gives you a blessing.
It seems to be a psychological thing.
Yeah, it's a psychological thing. It's therapy. It's therapy. That's why confessions have dropped off. Confessions? Who goes to confession nowadays? In the States, about 15 to 22%, they tell me. In Austria, it's 5%. In Belgium, it's 2%. In Spain, it's 11%. In England, they say about 3%. Confession is gone, because sin is gone. I really am not sinful, and the devil is, there's no such thing as the devil. I have tendencies which I can correct by going to a shrink, a therapist, or some of them I must let loose. I must have a little give. I must express myself one way or the other. And that's quite lawful, provided I don't hurt anybody. It's a victimless crime. It's a victimless action. And who cares what I do with Mary Jones down the street, or she with John Bull up the street? It doesn't hurt anybody, and God loves them all. They're all his children. So this idea of sin soiling the soul it's a primitive idea, and no longer coheres with what we know now about the soul, which we only know from shrinks, by the way.
I talked to a modern liturgist not too long ago, and he said that basically we're growing up now, and we're producing a new world. That's his line, and I'm sure it's the line of the modern church.
Oh yes, it is the modern line of the church. And it's the modern line of churchmen. They find that they no longer need preached sermons. When did you hear a sermon about the Pope's infallibility last? Or about the Petrine power, or about thou art Peter upon this rock? It is not mentioned. If a priest talks about that, everybody says, well, what's happening him? What is he talking about? It's no longer the theme of Catholicism. Or Our Lady's purity. Who's going to preach about Our Lady's purity?
I find that those kind of priests tend to get pushed out into the boondocks.
Oh, they disappear. In some dioceses, they're told to leave. They're told to go be gone on Monday, or else we'll call the police. This is happening in several of your dioceses in Canada, and priests are simply gone. They have no support. They leave with a suitcase, and that is that. That's the situation. Again, we go back to the basic thing. This can only happen, Bernard, if faith has been withdrawn. Faith has been withdrawn, and therefore, if you meet somebody who does that, all you can say is, they know not what they do any longer, as Christ said on the cross. They no longer see. They're not deliberately saying, well, this is against the faith, I'm going to do this. No, they don't believe any longer. They don't believe any longer. Which brings up a big question as to what Jesus, the King of the universe, and the head of the church, and the man from whom the Pope derives his authority, what is he planning? What is happening? Why is it like that? Why must it be like that? Is there misfeasance and malfeasance in high places, even with the present Pope or other popes? What has happened that is like that? That's the big question that's torturing people. And how then do I get out of it? Every week of my life, I have to talk with a father or a mother or both who say, what are we to do about this? We can't get them out. Or we haven't got the proper school for our children. They now don't believe in baptism.
How are we supposed to put all these tendencies into perspective? What is really going on here?
Well, I'll tell you about it. There's a way of considering that question is this. I don't know how many people I've heard say in the last 5 or 10 years to me, where is God? Where's Christ? Is he not supposed to be watching up for the church? Surely God is going to do something now. They usually said this to me apropos of some action of a bishop or a priest. We had finally had our 10th pederastic priest caught by the police, or we finally had some new statement by a bishop or a cardinal which went dead against what we were taught in school. And they say, well, why doesn't God step in? Surely he's going to appear in the heavens, or the Pope is going to do something. Why doesn't somebody do something? God or the Pope or Jesus or the angel? And you know, when his enemies captured Jesus, late at night, they probably held him from 9 p.m. until 6 p.m. the following day, when he slumped over and died with a loud cry, and Joseph of Arimathea came with the authorization to shift the body. During that time, I'm sure Our Lady didn't say it, I'm sure John the Evangelist didn't say it, perhaps Mary Magdalene didn't say it, but you may be sure that the 500 disciples gathered into Jerusalem, and all the apostles went around saying, well, he's going to suddenly wise up. God is going to intervene. He's going to send an army of angels to save him. He's going to do something. But you know, Bernard, he did nothing. It was to go inexorably through to entombment before a resurrection. Similarly with us, there isn't going to be an action of God. There's going to be no intervention of God. There's going to be no sudden change where everything will be hunky-dory, finally back Catholic as it was. Bernard, it will never be as it was. The church will never be restored as it was. That is dead and gone. We're going to entombment before we get to resurrection. You know, here's the problem. Take yourself back to First Friday, the Good Friday. And the word has come to Our Lady and the women with her and St. John that he's been condemned to die. And they're taking him out to Calvary. Everybody knew where Calvary was. Everybody knew it. Just as we know where Arlington is here in the States. Or you know someplace in Canada, well-known dead place. So they rushed out of the house to try and see him. They hadn't seen him for about 2 days. The last time they saw him was in Bethania with Lazarus and Mary and Martha, where he used to lie with them at night, cuddling them and holding them and being consoled. Because at that time, just prior to his passion, he was being attacked in the streets of Jerusalem, and he was under great pressure. So they rushed to the street, and they found a vantage point finally in the Via Dolorosa, where they could see the procession coming. Roman soldiers, the people, the priests, and this figure under the crossbeam. He was only carrying a crossbeam. The upright was always permanently on Calvary to receive the crossbeam in a socket. Now Our Lady, she had borne this body. She had seen him from the first moment he was born. She knew every line in that body. She knew all his features. And she had lived with him for all those years of his public life. She knew nothing about him. Yet when she saw that face coming around the corner, first of all clad in this awful robe they put on him in mockery, with a crown of thorns on him, the pallor of death on him, sweating, his face torn, his nose broken, with one black eye, we know from the shroud, and with all the blood he had lost. If you've ever seen a person dying in those conditions, I've seen them once, they're unrecognizable. You don't know them. She took time to notice her Jesus. She took a moment to see him. From some trait, some gesture, some look in his eye, something as he passed her. Similarly as with the church. We cannot recognize the Catholic Church today. It is so torn to pieces, so lacerated, so beaten up, so bloodied, so dehumanized or de-divinized. We have to have faith. This faith she had in the assassin of our Jesus. And then she went to Calvary to watch him die. We still have to see this being die completely, entombment, and to see the tears of it all. That's what we're facing. And that's what Jesus wills, apparently, to allow. And that's what we're facing into today. Entombment. Gradual entombment of the Catholic ideal. Everywhere. In public life and private life.
And could it be that those of us who are still practicing the Catholic faith are simply going to have to carry our cross?
That's right, until we die. And that's all that's required of us. What do you think Our Lady had to carry for all those years in faith? The same thing. She had what we had. She had him. We have him sacramentally. She had the mystery, the Annunciation, and the Visitation, and the Presentation, and the finding in the temple, and all the other mysteries we haven't been told about. That's all she had. And then the mysteries of his miracles in public life. And then finally his death. And until he appeared to her, I'm sure she was the first one he came to after his resurrection. And that scene is something I can't talk about. It's so emotional. But until that moment, she had no assurance beyond her faith. Yet she never wavered. She never wavered. So similarly with us, we may have to die as we are. And another generation find out what Christ's plans with the present world are. But we've only one thing to do, and that is faith and the Rosary and the Blessed Sacrament and Mass. We needn't bother about anything else. We haven't got the grace to do anything about it. He has not put us in a position to do anything about it. And all we do is live in our faith and die in our faith and don't compromise. That's all we can do. Because now the thing is cosmic. Now the thing is geopolitical. Now it's out of everybody's hands. Because from all the evidence we have, apparently Lucifer is in his last leg. He is going to extremes because he knows the end is near of this period. These Catholic times are coming to an end, and they'll be over soon, within this decade, the present Pope, I believe. And Satan will be totally rejected and lose the kingdom he has carved out for himself in the Catholic Church and in the world of man. And there'll be a complete changeover. How many of us will see it? I don't know. Do I want to see it? I'm indifferent. What I have to do is to be done every day. Carry my cross after him daily, as he said. That's all that's necessary. I can't bother about this huge struggle because it's beyond my powers. It's cosmic. It's geopolitical. It involves huge superpowers. It involves all the nations of the world. It involves the coming of Our Lady. And you know, one word about Our Lady. There's a scene in the early days of Lourdes. When it became known that Bernadette was talking to the lady, Notre Dame, the local peasants, she was a peasant, used to gather behind her, but she was talking to the lady standing in the grotto. They couldn't see it, they could hear her talking. And one day, while they were all there, and she was talking to her lady, Our Lady was talking about the Immaculate Conception, and Our Lady was smiling apparently. Suddenly, in one of the other caves, the place had little grottos and caves, a growling as of wild animals started. And the people heard it. It was a very strange growling, a rumbling, threatening growl, as if wild animals were inside and were about to come out and rend them limb from limb. And Bernadette later said that all Our Lady did, she didn't say a word, all Our Lady did was move her head and look at the cave, and it all stopped like that. That's power. That's power. And she can stop all this suddenly by her will, invested with the power of God. But she must do it. And when she do it, we don't know. She has said she will do it. But until then, this stream of filth and corruption and decadence in the church, the institutional organization, is going to go on unabated. And you and I can't stop it, except by prayer. And prayer for individuals, clergy and laity. Prayer for this cause or that cause. We can't stop the onrush of this drama, because it is a drama. It is Satan in the final throes of his struggle against Jesus. He's had his liberty, and he's done damage. And he's gained millions of souls. They're falling like leaves into hell, Our Lady told Lucia. Leaves, cardinals, bishops, priests, lay people, men and women and children. But she will end it all, she said, because he has granted that power to my Immaculate Heart.
And of course, that is part of the message of Fatima, that she will end it all.
That is the message. But we don't know when, we don't know how, and we needn't bother. That's not our job. It's too big for us all. Pity therefore the man in Rome, John Paul II, caught in the engrenage, the mechanism of the superforce, inhabiting his Vatican, faced with the total revolt of his bishops, and the falling away of whole nations in faith, having to sit down with Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, knowing that Gorbachev himself is caught in the net of God's providence, and knowing that perhaps he'll return to the faith he had when he was a boy of 10, singing old Slavonic hymns beside his mummy before Holy Communion in the parish church of Privonaya in southern Russia. Perhaps he won't. Perhaps he'll go to hell with the rest of them who have opposed God. And knowing that he's only a puppet, that God can break into at any given moment once he's done the work God wants him to do in the recreation of man's devotion to God. Pity him, though, his judgment, the weight, the burden on it. And no wonder for being a fresh-faced, almost leopard-like walking man, walking like a panther, he now is worn, stark-faced. He walks slowly. He's carrying a burden, a deep burden. And he has to sit down opposite a pagan like that, who has his little cunning Leninist plot, and who's smiling and smiling like a villain, as Shakespeare said. And he must pray for him, and must shake hands with him and his wife, and try in some way to leave some drop of grace in him from his words and from the action of Jesus. And still he must know that he himself carries the burden of waiting for Mary, for the right time and the right place. Pity this man. Pity him. He needs prayer. He needs consolation. He needs support. He needs prayer.
I think that's what all of us must do is pray, because all of us, I'm sure, have a burden that we must carry, especially families.
Yeah, families have. Families, they're now the points of support, because we no longer, for instance, in my young days, if you had a problem with the parish priest or the curate, the assistant you knew, or if you could, the bishop, you could go to the bishop with a problem. Nowadays, the last person you go to is the local priest, or the local bishop, or the local assistant. We won't go near them, because you'll find that they, first of all, they're in charge of the plant. It's a 9-to-5 job. They have no sympathy with you if you're going to talk about the intimacy of Catholics with the Trinity or with Our Lady. They'll regard you with a slight smile. They might indulge it because you're not offensive, you want some help. But they'll give you some book which is written in new language and about themes that, and they'll ask you to come to a meeting and share the joy of being with the others. And they may, on an odd case, be very enthusiastic for some place like Medjugorje in Yugoslavia, a new apparition of Our Lady.
Let's talk a bit about this apparition. Do you think it's real?
Personally, on a personal plane, I concluded Medjugorje is a satanic hoax.
And why do you say that?
I say that because of three main reasons. First of all, if I examine those apparitions, appearances, I prefer the word appearance, of Our Lady, say Lourdes, La Salette, Guadalupe in Mexico, Our Lady of Revelations in Tre Fontane in Rome, which is the latest one, Fatima, Garabandal in Spain in 1961-62. I find one note always there. The participants, as they call them, the seers, always submitted to the church. And when, sometimes through years of silence, persecution, sometimes imprisonment, certainly badgering and interrogation, waiting for church approval, which finally came. Medjugorje is totally different. Total revolt. No, we're talking to Our Lady every day. She says this. She told us to say this. We're going to say this. The local bishop has been shunted aside by the Medjugorje people, whereas not the, I think it's now 13 million people have come to Medjugorje on pilgrimage. And there are confessions and rosaries and pilgrimages and processions every day over there. A huge amount of tourist money has gone into Yugoslavia. The Marxist authorities at that time were very, very enthusiastic about Medjugorje because it increased tourism. But apart from that question of the material benefits, there's that one side. It was not submissive to the authority. You see, if the authority is even unjust, you have to submit to it if it has the authority. Christ said that. Upon the chair of Moses have the scribes and Pharisees said, don't do as they do, but do as they say. They have the authority. That's the first sign for me that Medjugorje is not for me, certainly. I can't touch it. Number two, it's for Our Lady is quoted as saying that other faiths are just as good as ours. Leave the Muslims alone. There are a lot of Muslims in Yugoslavia. Their faith is just for them, it's good. It's not for you. I can't imagine Our Lady saying that. I just can't imagine Our Lady saying that. And there are a whole list of things like that, plus funny incidents. For instance, once during a documented incident, once during the supposed apparition when the children were talking to Our Lady, a French newsman with typical French influence, the children's eyes are always fixed on this invisible object, Our Lady. He pointed his finger to the eye of one of the children and the children back up. Now, if the child was, if the seer was totally absorbed, how could it be like this? So the priest, Vanek, who was there, gathered the child in his arms and went off into the sacristy. For a moment, he came back and said, well, the child actually thought the child Jesus was falling from the arms of Our Lady, and he was shocked. So it's obviously a sham. Then there are other things connected with the fact that Our Lady used to appear in the fields, first of all, and then they got it transferred to the sacristy, or a little chapel, a little room opposite the sacristy in the parish church. And there are whole behaviorisms there. And then the subsequent history of Vanek and other people connected with it that do not smell of heaven. Then there is the alchemy touch. You know, the medieval alchemists used to, by the power of the devil, they could change lead into gold. And there is this funny thing of your rosary beads turning from ordinary metal into gold. We had that in Mercedes, in Wisconsin too.
We had it in Bayside.
Yeah, we have it in Bayside too today. It's alchemy, it's medieval alchemy, an old trick of the devil's. And then there are things like that that are very funny. There's one other factor which is going to make you laugh, but which for me is paramount because I'm Irish. The Irish say the devil can cloak every part of him, make himself the most beautiful angel of light except his feet. He can't hide the hooves. Nobody has ever described Our Lady's feet in any way. Everything else perfect. Bernadette said there are roses on her instep. And Garabandal, same thing. Conchita has described Our Lady's feet. At Maygoy, no mention of the feet. And I'm sufficiently Irish still to say the hooves. He can't hide the hooves. He always appears with hooves. This is the Irish idea of the devil as a goat, as an unclean goat. But it's only a sign. It's not the Durham factor in my decision about Maygoy. Now, if tomorrow the Pope says Maygoy is fine, there have been abuses, then I will submit. But, you know, unless Peter speaks, and has spoken for Garabandal, it has spoken for Lourdes, spoken for La Salette, spoken for Fatima, it has not spoken and refuses to speak, and is very critical of Maygoy, and therefore I, as a Catholic, cannot go along with it at all. Until Peter does speak one way or the other, I hang fire. My impression personally is that he's in the house.
There have been a proliferation of many apparitions or so-called apparitions in the last 10 or 20 years. And
260 today.
That's incredible. And some of the better known ones are Nisida or Bayside or the Pebble in Australia.
Japan, Africa, they're all over the place. One common trait of a lot of these so-called or claimed apparitions is this. They seem to be imitations of Fatima, like Maygoy. As if to steal away. My own theory or feeling is that they're supposed to diminish the interest in Fatima, which is the central revelation of this century, private revelation. And they all seem to be imitations of that, one way or the other. They promise the same things, and Our Lady speaking about the same things, and tell destruction, and say the rosary, and come and visit me here now. In other words, take away from the dire message of Fatima, which is still running, the writ of Fatima is still running. In Ireland alone, the amount of virgins, statues of the Virgin that started crying. There's a book written about it I have in my library. I suspect hoaxes everywhere because the devil is so clever. He's so intelligent. And he's introduced great confusion about this. So we have Maygoy, we have the Kita, we have the Pebble, and we have the Bayside. This is all nonsense, the conclusion is. It's all illusions. That's the general idea. The only other apparition appears of Our Lady, which seems to be grips my soul, is the one in the Ukraine. That is something which is special. There's no doubt about that. But we haven't had, the Holy See has not been able to penetrate into the Ukraine to examine the facts. And the bishops have been in hiding, so there's no question of finding out if it's true or false. But the proliferation, I think, is typically satanic. It's like when we were invading England, when we were invading France, in D-Day, we dropped, I think, thousands of little rubber paratroopers in parachutes, and the Germans spent a lot of ammunition and a lot of time rounding them up. They call them gummisoldaten.
It's like diversion.
That's right, it's a diversion. Diverting people from the Fatima itself, which has a very dire and exact Catholic message, full of devotion to the papacy, full of devotion to the Passion, full of devotion to purity and to honesty and to Catholic virtues, and it's full of the Catholic intimacy. There's no intimacy in Maygoy at all. It's a different thing completely. So that's my judgment of Maygoy. That's what I think about Maygoy, and why, until Peter speaks, I cannot share any enthusiasm for it. I'm afraid of it. There's one other note in it, and it's this. There's a charismatic note, a Pentecostalist note. Everybody who's become a Maygoy enthusiast, for me, suddenly becomes an authority. The Holy Ghost is speaking to them. They know exactly about everything. And I find that not humble. People who go to Lourdes, who are devoted to Fatima, they all are affected by this strange meekness and humility you find Our Lady talking about. There's none of that in Maygoy. It's triumphalistic. It's the banner. It's the thing. You must believe this. It's something I find that disturbing to myself.
Could it be that the proliferation of these apparitions is an attempt to fill a void that many Catholics have in their lives? No longer can they go to their parishes for devotions, and so they're looking for something, and these apparitions are filling a void.
Of course. And I think they're being filled by Satan. I don't think it's Our Lady is doing it. I think Satan is saying, oh, you want something special? You want something really intimate with divinity? Our Lady is appearing over there on top of the pillar. I think that's it. Or we create them ourselves. I think that's true. It's answering a felt need, but it's not answering the Catholic response.
Is the same maybe true of the charismatic movement?
Well, I, from the very beginning, have been very, very unenthusiastic about the charismatic movement. I know charismatics whom I esteem an awful lot and who are marvelous Catholics, but there's a spirit in the charismatic movement. It's like me and the sergeant. Suddenly, they have direct communication with the Holy Spirit. And I've been at the charismatics meetings where they speak in tongues. And I know from Scripture that the Scripture doesn't speak about what they call speaking in tongues. In Scripture, speaking in tongues means speaking in languages which are intelligible to somebody. There's no such thing as speaking gibberish. I was beside Cardinal Sunan once, when in the middle of one of these charismatic readings, he said, Agalam Hunk. And it was translated by somebody as meaning that Jesus loves us all. This is not scriptural. It's invented. It's invented in Wisconsin by the Pentecostalist movement back in the 60s, I think, or wherever it started, and taken over by the Catholics. It's a great way of letting go, of letting off steam.
It's also, I think, a search for easy answers.
That's right.
Like with these apparitions. That's right. It's a way, in a way, having a direct pipeline to God. It's a way of avoiding the cross.
That's right. It's also a way of avoiding church authority, telling you to do this and not to do that, when it's great church authority. I am now speaking to the Holy Ghost. He speaks to me. And I still find it ruthless at a charismatic meeting when somebody stands up and says, Iki Gogo Panan Gogo, and somebody in the chorus stands up and says, she is now telling us that the Christ child loves us all. Now the utterly babel we know already. Mm-hmm. How do they know that? They say a gift. The church has never blessed it. It was St. Paul VI who made the mistake of giving any encouragement to Catholic charismatic movement. We had a charismatic movement, devotion to the Holy Spirit, which is typically Catholic, long before the Pentecostalists in America gathered round and invented the whole idea. We had devotion to the Holy Ghost. We had orders devoted to the Holy Spirit. And we have a huge treasure house of doctrine and piety and devotional practices in honor of the Holy Spirit. We've always had that. This is Catholic. This is tradition. This belongs to our perennial church, not this newfangled thing which is an antidote for my seediness, an effort to give me a status. That I am now talking to the Holy Spirit directly. Don't interrupt me, and I'll tell you what he says. You may not understand it, but somebody else in the congregation who has the gift will tell you what. This is not Catholicism. Christ didn't speak like that. He spoke in plain language.
There almost seems to be an attempt to suppress those old traditional things.
They don't want anything to do with that. That's the Catholic Church. That is out. That is prescribed. Hence, I always speak about Catholics and Neo-Catholics. There is a Neo-Catholic movement in the Church. It is trying to change everything to a new format in order to be modern. And that's, I think, the biggest legacy of Vatican II, because that it did create this new church within the church. It is an anti-church. It wants to leave behind everything else and have new ways of doing things and of living and of marrying and of dying.
And isn't its symbol the new Mass?
Oh, the new Mass. The new Mass I think, is the fountainhead of all our difficulties. And it's a calamity because it was our friend Monsignore Annibale Bognini who drew up that Mass, deliberately in order to create a non-Catholic ceremony. And the difficulty with the new Mass is that it has given rise to invalid Masses, and therefore the lack of the Blessed Sacrament. And it has also removed people's minds from the central point of the Mass, the sacrifice of Calvary. It now is a meal. It's a communal meal. And it's at a table. And the priest is the minister. But we, the people, are the people who have the meal together. This is all based on a Protestant, non-Catholic idea of what the Mass is. You see, people come to me because they find out I'm saying the normal Roman Mass, and they say, could I go to your Mass, please? And I say, well, let's sit down and have a little talk. And we have a talk, and I find out, I ask them, what is the Mass? And they tell me usually that it's the Last Supper. That's a meal, commemorative meal. And I say, no, I'm sorry, we haven't got a meal at all. Some of them do, though, hit the nail on the head. They say it's the sacrifice of Calvary. And I say, then what you mean in general is that it's an action. something takes place on the altar. They say yes. And then I say, all right, you've been going to the new order, the novice order for so long. Give me 2 or 3 weeks and come to instruction twice a week for an hour. And I will teach you what takes place as mirrored in my actions as priest. When you can interpret my actions symbolically, symbolizing the action taking place on the altar, then I'll admit you to my Mass. And it's great. They learn the Mass thoroughly. They learn that every gesture has a meaning focused on Calvary, on the cross. And they suddenly say, but this is great. This is something I never taught. And they never knew it. They were never taught it. These are young people. They weren't born back in the time I was born. They suddenly realized that going to church is not a question of singing in and saying hello to the pastor and being greeted and then be given bread and wine to drink and feel happy about it, shaking hands with others, embracing them, and having breakfast afterwards, which is a continuation of the sacred meal. But it's a question of assisting at the action of Christ dying and living forever.
Could it be then that what they've done to the Mass is symbolic of what they've done in the whole church, and that is to try to remove those sacrificial aspects from Catholicism, the cross from Catholicism, make it something easy and nice and palatable to the world?
That's right. It's exactly it. I couldn't put it better myself. That's what they have effectively done. And that is, you can ask yourself then the funny thing, that the moment a priest proposes to say the Roman Mass in a diocese, oh, there's horror. I mean, just get out of here. The priest is told to go, or they get at him and say, this is impossible, you can't do this. The Holy Father doesn't want this. The Church doesn't do this any longer. This is old hat. We now have the Novus Order. You do this or either or. There's a horror of the Mass, an absolute horror, and disgust. I remember reading a very prominent French theologian, a Jesuit, quite recently, who said that by chance he had to assist at one of the Roman Masses in Paris. He said he found it disgusting. The idea of a man turning his back on the populace and praying quietly. Such a disgusting idea. And I know that Jesuit has lost it. He no longer knows what goes on. And that's the destruction of the center of Catholicism, because believe you me, without the Mass, and without Holy Communion, without that Mass, Catholicism dies. That's why the Irish, for 400 years, used to have rock Masses. They had a rock behind which the priest hid and the people gathered and they said Mass. Keep the Mass going. Now that it's died out, now that we have invalid Masses, and we have many invalid Masses, because many priests are not validly ordained, and many bishops don't ordain validly, no wonder grace is lacking. You get sanctifying grace through the sacraments, namely the Blessed Eucharist and the Holy Communion. That's the plight of the Church, and the effort has been to destroy that.
This interview is the last of a series with Father Malachi Martin on the situation in the Church today. And this one is going to discuss the situation in Rome, where I believe you worked for several years, didn't you?
That's right, I did, Bernard. I did work there. And Rome leaves an indelible imprint on your soul. The Italians say, non si parte di Roma. You never leave Rome. And it's true. You never leave Rome in your spirit, even if you leave it in body. Because there's something about Rome that is both fascinating and holy, and something unholy. And perhaps it's the unholy element we want to talk about. It has always been an enigma for people outside, because all they see is a group of men running around in skirts with colored robes on them and taking part in ceremonies, and they wonder how the whole thing runs, and what makes it go. And above all, in the present situation of the Church, when we have shambles on every side and dissidents from papal authority throughout the Church and in Rome, what's going on? What's happening? What's happening exactly? See, most Catholics don't realize the following fact, that it is our faith to believe, it is our faith to believe that the Pope will always be Bishop of Rome. That's our faith. Fide definita. The Bishop of Rome, the lawful Bishop of Rome, is the successor to St. Peter. Therefore he is the personal representative of Jesus Christ on this earth, as long as he's alive. It's also a faith that, and this is called the factum Romanum, the Roman fact,
that even if he ended up living in a forest glade in Tasmania, Rome would still be the center of the church, the See of Rome. That sticks in the gullet, to use an American phrase, of many modernists today who don't want a Rome-centered religion. But that is a fact, that the actual physical setting is part of our faith. And just as Calvary is the actual setting of Christ's crucifixion, and nobody can change that. So this location of the personal representative of Jesus on earth is a fact belonging to faith. It goes beyond history. And that's the complicating factor, because you have this man, he's a cardinal nowadays, usually has been for almost 1,000 years, over 1,000 years. He's elected by his peers. It's the only elective office in the official structure of the church. Everything else is a pontiff. In theory, once elected, the cardinal electors who elect him don't give him papal power. They can't give him that. They haven't got it. What they do theologically is they say to the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, that's the man we think should be Pope. And therefore when he says, I accept it, the power descends on him. And from then on, he's totally separate from them. He is Pope. There's that one fact, and then around him is gathered a bureaucracy which is unequaled in its age, a chancery that existed back in the time of Charlemagne, and before that, in the time of the Huns, the time of Gregory the Great, Leo XIII, and still exists today, and is the most skilled chancery that exists, and has suddenly come into its own in the, say, the Noriega incident, where everybody, including the President of the United States and the American Expeditionary Force and the Panamanians and all the American countries, found out that by far the best skill in diplomacy was used by the Vatican diplomats. They were utterly skillful in managing the entire difficult situation.
Do they have an intelligence network which is greater than any other in the world?
Sure, sure. That's why, finally, in spite of the Protestant opposition to it, the United States Senate voted to set up diplomatic relations with the Vatican, because the information pouring out of there, if you can get a hold of it, is accurate and total. It covers the whole world. And now, for instance, today, above all about Eastern Europe and Russia, Soviet Union and China, the Vatican is teeming with information on a 24-hour basis, coming from all over the world and about those areas, which is inaccessible, which is not accessible to other people. So it's a very valuable place. And there is this, not imperial, but certainly geopolitical attitude in Rome. They will look on a problem in Rwanda or Urundi in the center of Black Africa in the light of all the problems connected with it, both in Africa and Europe and America. They have this total view of it all. They're geopoliticians, because they're in a geopolitical structure, which is very different from anything that the outside world has. The only other man who understands them perfectly is Mikhail Gorbachev, the present strongman in Russia, because he heads the only other geopolitical structure in the world, which is Leninism. That's why there's such a meeting of minds between him and John Paul II. They understand each other. They don't agree, but they understand each other.
Now let's bring it back from geopolitical terms back to local terms.
Yes.
You have many lay people are asking the question. We see everything going haywire in the church and all kinds of abuses going on. You see something is amiss. And why doesn't Rome do something to stop what seems to be almost the destruction of Catholicism?
I'll tell you, they are accurate in this sense. It is the destruction of the institutional organization, the visible structure. But it's a very insidious destruction, because the structure is left there, standing. There are cardinals and bishops and priests and dioceses and parishes and universities and schools and emissaries and meetings and conventions and congresses and synods. The whole thing, seemingly, what are you talking about? The structure is still intact. But nobody except somebody very prejudiced would even think of saying that that structure is Catholic in the sense it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Pius XII couldn't stand a structure like that, nor Pius XI, nor any of the early popes, up to John the 23rd. So the question is, what's happening? Why is that happening? Why isn't Rome doing something? Hasn't Rome got the power? The answer in shorthand, in simple, brief terms, is this. Rome itself has been corrupted. The bureaucracy has been corrupted. There is resident in the Vatican bureaucracy, small and limited as it is, but all-powerful, there is this anti-church partisanship which is out to change the face of Catholicism. And the church they envisage is something completely different. It's not a church centered in the Roman pontiff's rule. It's not a church which is centralized in Roman authority, jurisdiction. It's a church, it's a Rome which heads a collection of autonomous communities bound together by ancient tradition and by sentiment, and of which the head, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, is a very honored man because he's the 264th or 265th successor to St. Peter. But the Church of Peter, the Church of Pius XII, the Church of Pius V, the Church of Gregory XIV, they don't want that. They have another ecclesiology completely. And the theological underpinning, the theological belief at the back of it all is a different idea of salvation. You see, the church is built, the Catholic Church is built on the principle that many are called but few are chosen. The saved are few. Not perhaps a minority, but certainly not the totality. Whereas nowadays the cry is that all men are saved. All faiths are equal. Just if you're a Catholic, be a good Catholic. If you're a good Presbyterian, be a good Presbyterian. If you're a Muslim, be a good Muslim, and you'll be saved.
So conversion is no longer the name of the game.
Oh, no. No. Catholic teaching is no Presbyterian is saved because he was a good Presbyterian. No Muslim is saved because he was a good Muslim. If I am a Hindu, and I'm a good Hindu, if there's such a thing, I'm sure there is, but if, you've got to meet them to find out, and I'm saved not because I'm a good Hindu, but because the grace of the Catholic Church was communicated to me by some mercy of God. Similarly with a good Presbyterian, or a good Protestant, or a good Jew. If they're saved, not because they were good Protestants or good Jews, it's because somehow, in spite perhaps of my Judaism or my Presbyterianism, the grace of the Catholic Church was communicated to me, because outside the church there is no salvation. And they mean the visible church. Not the mystical body, they mean the visible church. But nowadays, as you know, the principle is that, well, we're all equal, let's be ecumenical. Remember, the word ecumenical originally meant Christians. Now it means anybody who gathers in who professes some religion, who's a Hindu or a North American Indian or an animist. He joins in the ecumenical gatherings, and they're all to be saved. They're all saved by being good North American Indians or good Buddhists, good Hindus, good Confucianists. That's the theological basis of it all. The old ecclesiology of the few and the many, the church of the elect and the others, is out the window for the modern theologian, and it has permeated Rome. Now, it's very important because it affects the Mass. That's why they've changed the words of the Mass. Instead of saying, when consecrating the wine, which shall be shed for you and for many, they changed it to for you and for all. That's the reason for the change. That's what invalidates those words in the Mass and makes them null and void. The wine is not consecrated. And that's why it's an invalid Mass as such. So this is at the back of it all. And the vast horror and reaction of horror to any proposal that the Tridentine Mass be brought back is based on that theology. They won't have anything to do with that old doctrine. They want to be able to face the world and say, we're all in the same boat. We all belong to the same thing. You're saved, we're saved. Just be good. Be reasonable. Be compassionate. Be kind.
That's the new ideology, is an ecumenical ideology.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, why they have also altered the Mass.
They had to. They couldn't say the old Mass. They couldn't say the old Mass. They don't subscribe to the doctrine, which is the doctrine of the Church, de fide, definita. Outside the church, there is no salvation. What they say is, yes, we can subscribe to that, but now church means church in the broad sense, all those who love God in their own way. Of course, then we're outside Catholicism, in that case.
So we've seen the ideology of the new religion. Let's take a look at how it works in practice, how, let's say, the Roman bureaucracy functions. Who has the authority? How are decisions made there?
Well, decisions are made in a bureaucratic way. You could trace the authority, the governing authority in Rome, through four people. You have the Holy Father. After him, you have the Secretary of State. And after him, you have the Sostituto. He's the Vice Secretary of State. And then you have the Foreign Minister. At the present moment, those posts are occupied by John Paul II, who's Pope. The Secretary of State is Casaroli. The Sostituto, the Vice Secretary of State, is Cassidy. He's just been changed, but there's a man called Re put into it, in the place there. And the Foreign Minister is Sodano, Archbishop Sodano. They make all the practical decisions. Under them, then, there are about 15 ministries dealing with various aspects of the church: religious orders, the sacraments, marriage, the missions, the doctrine of the faith, and so on. Now, the decisions made there by those men engaged in those particular areas, they all pass through those 4 or 5 people for approval, because they probably have political impact. So the machinery works like that. Then in the ministries, there are a flood of secretaries and consultants and experts and minutantes, they call them, people who are serving their time in hope of rising in the bureaucracy. And that swells into a personnel of about 3,500 or 4,000 people. Mainly clerics, some laymen, some women. That's the machinery with which the Pope works. Now, the main ministries are peopled by cardinals and archbishops and bishops. It's a known fact that, and then there are people who are semi-retired, some of them living in the Vatican, sometimes living out of the Vatican, but they all have a say because they've all got friendships and contacts and they've experience. In that bureaucracy as such, there has been lodged since the early 1960s an element which in Roman parlance is called the superforce, or the anti-church. And it is something which is hell-bent on changing the structure of the church as regards belief. Namely, that it is no longer to be a Rome-centered community. It's to be a central hub of information and a sort of an honorary chairman of a vast organization with totally different communities all over the world, with their own ways of thinking and looking and believing and praying.
It seems that the superforce is very powerful because it seems to have the ability to frustrate work of men who, let's say, want to restore some semblance of tradition. For example, Cardinal Meyer has found himself frustrated in his work of working to restore the traditional Mass.
Yeah, he has found it impossible. He can't do it. After a certain point, he flings his arms in the air. He can't do anything about it because the power of the church is canonical. It depends on law and who has the power to wield that law, the canon law. The wielding of that canon law is in the hands of people who are inimical to what Meyer stands for, to what the Pope stands for. And they can't do anything about it. You can't simply fire everybody all of a sudden. You have a completely decimated church. It won't run. There'll be no control at all, no government. So the changeover of that means you weed them out slowly and replace them. But in order to replace somebody, say in the congregation for the missions, the ministry for the missions, it's an elective thing. He's appointed or elected by the members of the congregation, but they themselves are affected. So you've got to fire them too if you want to clean it out. So how are you going to scour it all out? Find the proper men to replace them all? There are careers, people who went there at the age of 20 or 25 and are still there at the age of 60. And they have friendships and they have built-in positions of power. They can block motions. They can put things at the bottom of a pile of papers so it never comes up for discussion. The bureaucratic power is something out of this world. Diocletian, the emperor, decided that he would like to change the Roman bureaucracy of his time, and it was nothing like this. He took 17 years to even lop off the top of it, and then he didn't even succeed. And I think it would be impossible to clean up the bureaucracy itself. There is the vandal solution, as you know, what Cordell Hull once said about the Secretary of State. The way you deal with the Secretary of State, he said, the Department of State, is you wipe it out and you put one solitary desk in the middle of a room and say, that's the Department of State from now on. You start at the bottom. Because the Vandals, as you know, came into a city, they wiped everything out. They left nothing, just took the gold and the women, killed the children and the men, and went away. That's the Vandal solution if you want to start anything. Wipe everything out and start all over again. Because you can't weed out the bureaucracy. It's the same thing now. The Poles have a difficulty in Poland, but they have a non-communist government, but there are tens of thousands of communists in every branch of government. How do you're blocked at every step. And the same thing in Czechoslovakia, same thing in Bulgaria. Not so much in Romania, they were killing them and weeding them off. They have a quick solution for it all. Same thing with Gorbachev in Russia. He's up against this intense bureaucracy. The Vatican is the oldest bureaucracy in the world, and they're more salted away than anybody else. So the Pope is blocked in every way. And he himself is a traditional Catholic, a strong believer in everything that is traditional, and yet he has to sit on top of this pyramid and find that a decision of his to get people to stop using communion in the hand, which he forbade in the beginning, went nowhere. Because the principle was, let's violate his law, and in the end we'll have to declare it the local custom, which is exactly what happened. And that's why in a crucial thing, in a thing like communion in the hand, it's not so crucial, although it's a disobedience, but say women priests. We know that in the United States that 32 women have undergone ordination privately.
Is that right?
Yeah. Now we know they say Mass, as they say, they go through the motions, regularly. Supposing they come out and say, we're priests, we're ordained by Bishop so-and-so who's now dead, and they have a congregation, and supposing they keep on doing this, eventually the local people say, well, you know, Holy Father, they exist and they're good priests.
It seems to me that sometimes to get things done, what the liberals do is they break the law, then it becomes a precedent.
That's right.
And then it becomes entrenched.
That's exactly what it is. Like confession for children before communion. The Pope has said again and again they must have confession before their first Holy Communion. Oh no. And now it's become the common practice not to have confession before Holy Communion. Communion in the hand is the same thing. It's forbidden originally. Or communion distributed by lay people, originally only in case of necessities. In my parish church in Dublin, where I was reared from the age of 10 until 18, there are 5 priests, and they have 22 Eucharistic ministers. They don't need them at all. But now it's the habit. And originally it was forbidden, except in cases of necessity. General confession is another one. Case of necessity only can you have general confession. Now it's becoming a general habit. Because they're doing it anyway. They say, if we do it long enough, it's become a precedent and it's an established practice. We can say to Rome, we've been doing this for years. How can you wipe it out? People are used to it now. That's the principle. And Rome doesn't block it. If a law is violated in Ireland or in America, in Detroit or in Toronto or wherever it is, they should immediately, past the 12th, past the 11th, would have immediately expelled the people doing it. That'd be the end of it. Nowadays they don't do that. Rome is silent. Why? Because the people involved in Rome are in sympathy. Now, if you were to ask me about John Paul II, how many ministries would really stand up with him, behind him? I'd say 2, at the most. Really back him up? Only 2.
Which are those 2?
Probably the Congregation for the Defense of the Faith under Cardinal Ratzinger, and probably the marriage. The Rota, probably. But the others, no. They'd militate against him. They'd oppose his decisions. Unless those decisions went their way, they wouldn't do it.
Let's take a look at Cardinal Ratzinger, because he is a subject of quite a bit of interest.
Yes, he is. He's a key man, too.
What are the strengths and weaknesses of his position?
His main weakness is that he's isolated in the middle of a very modernist-minded clergy. And he has to deal with very modernist-minded bishops all over the world, including his native Germany and in America and Canada. Another weakness of his is that he is not aware of things. He's not aware of things. He comes to New York last year, gives a lecture here, and somebody asks him, what do you think of Father Raymond Brown, who's a scripture expert? And Ratzinger, without thinking, without knowing, says, I wish to God the church had about a half a dozen Father Raymond Browns. Now, Father Raymond Brown is, in my books, a heretic. He's written books about the New Testament that are totally unacceptable. Why did Ratzinger say that? Why did he say that? And in public? How could he wish that 6 of them, 10 Raymond Browns on the church? God knows. But he did say that. So he's ignorant in that sense and unwary in that sense. And that's a pity, because he is supposed to be the head of the doctrine, guarding the purity of the faith. Then he also, one of his weaknesses is that he's impotent. He cannot impose his views even when they are correct. For instance, how is it that Father Charles Kern still has faculties in the Diocese of Rochester here? He can still hear confessions and preach. Ratzinger is the one who should send an order to the Bishop of Rochester, get rid of him, excommunicate him. He doesn't. He can't. Therefore, there's an innate weakness in his position from the very weakness of the structure itself. Similar with a Walter Casper, or a Bishop Layman, or hundreds of other bishops who are outside the church in their doctrine and teaching and their behavior. The homosexual bishops we have in the United States who have known homosexual companions in their houses. Why can't he get rid of them? He can't. So he has that weakness in his position too. Then you see, there's something else about Ratzinger which is always causing people to think. It is that he doesn't seem to be aware of the suffering of people. He doesn't know what people suffer because they can't get Mass. He doesn't realize what poignant agonies they go through when they've got priests who are saying invalid Masses, or saying a form of the Novus Ordo which is obviously invalid. He doesn't realize it. He just doesn't realize they're being deprived of sanctifying grace through the mischief of modernist priests and bishops in the locality. He doesn't. He's closed away from the reality of pain that we're going through as a people. He's closed away from it. The same thing holds in Canada. He doesn't realize it. And in many dioceses in Canada, there are bishops who are simply acting in a way that's inimical to the cause of the church. When a priest wants to preach foundational Catholic theology, he's told to go. He should be able to write to Ratzinger, go to Ratzinger, and get installed and get the bishop flung out in his ear, because the bishop is a heretic. But Ratzinger doesn't do that. He's blocked in that. Why? Well, the Congregation of Bishops has its own point of view, and it's anti-John Paul II in ways. And John Paul II can't back him because he can't force the Congregation of Bishops.
Is this national conferences of bishops, in fact, a way of blocking Rome's authority?
Well, you see, the National Conference of Bishops, each National Conference of Bishops is now trying to develop into a community independent and autonomous, can make its own decisions about any subject, in doctrine, in faith, in practice, and Rome can't say boo to it. And that's the whole idea, the new idea of collegiality is that the bishops of America can decide that it's good to have women priests. They can decide that it's good to have condoms. They can decide that in 2 cases, when the death of a mother is imperiled, or the life of a mother is imperiled, or the child is the result of rape, that there should be abortion. They can and will decide that. Or we must have deaconesses. They've decided that. They can decide that against the will of Rome and impose it. Similarly, the French Conference of Bishops, and so on, the Spanish Conference of Bishops. Same thing, they want to be independent. It's a new form of an old heresy called Gallicanism, which was condemned as heretical, but now it's come out in this form. And Rome is incapable of doing anything about it at the present moment, because the difficulty is this, that as long as John Paul II is Pope, it's fine. If tomorrow he died and they held a conclave, going down the roster of the papal electors, the cardinal electors, I am not sure we would not find ourselves presented with a modernist Pope.
Is that part of the agenda of the modernists, is to get one of their own elected as Pope?
Of course. That would be the end, then, of what they call the papal church, the patriarchal church, the ancient church, which is no longer suitable for the modern world. But you see, between now and then, there's a lot of water going to flow under the bridge. That's why John Paul II treads very warily. He wants no second assassination attempt. and he wants no real obstacles put in his way. He's about something. He's engaged in something else completely, some other mission, far removed from this problem. He tolerates this, tries to maintain a unity, a facade of unity anyway, and hopes that what he's hoping for will happen soon.
Is he aware that there's a problem out there? Does he have good information?
His eyes have been blinded with videos, and his ears have been deafened with audio, and his ears have been filled with accounts of it all. He knows it all. He knows it all, and can do nothing about it. He knows he can't do anything about it. He could rant and rave, he could excommunicate, and create a worse situation than ever. There's no way out. It wouldn't renew the faith. It wouldn't renew a seminary.
So we find a situation where the head of the church is hemmed in and is not really, in the true sense, the head of the church.
He is in the eyes of God, he is in the eyes of believers, but he's not. He's the head of the church without the power. He hasn't got the power. They are hoping they will stop all practice, all attempt to practice the Petrine office, so that it falls into obsolescence, into desuetude, and they can say, well, this has never been done for the last pontificate. The last pope never did this, so why should you do it? Speaking to another Holy Father.
It's to set a precedent.
That's right. That's right. And make it one of those relics stuck in a Vatican cellar that once was used and is no longer used. That's the idea of it. And they've come to that point to a large degree. The Pope's voice doesn't really hold in dioceses now, in the United States, for instance, in Canada. It's not what the Pope wants. It's what the local bishop has decided.
The local bishop is really getting the best of both worlds, because he has, to a certain extent, still the authority from Rome.
Oh,
he
yes.
has the implicit approval of Rome.
That's right.
And yet he can still do everything he likes.
Oh yes. There's no hold on that bishop, unless he really puts his foot in it. We have had a few, like Bishop Garrity out in New Jersey, who had to leave overnight, long before retiring age. But that's because he really made a mess of things. But others have got away with murder and still getting away with murder, and they can't be touched. Because Rome hasn't got the power to do it any longer. And the bishop seems to have the best of both worlds in that sense. I don't think he's going to have the best of the next world, but certainly of the two worlds, his own particular world and the Roman world, yes, he has the best of it for the moment. But what is he going to say to Christ when he's confronted at his particular judgment? And Christ said, you dissipated the power of Peter, who represents me. Why did you disobey him? Why did you listen to those Freemasons? Why had you got a homosexual lover? Why did you expel the homosexual priests? Why did you allow theologians teach heresy in my seminary? Why did you allow invalid masses? Do you realize the souls that were lost by that? What is the poor man to answer? I was crazy, Lord. I didn't believe. Oh boy.
Let's take a look at some of the key players now in the Vatican, perhaps some of the liberals who are part of this super force. And the first one that always comes to mind is Cardinal Casseroli.
Yes, well, Casseroli's role is not so much as a liberal, it is in his attitude to things. You see, nobody would think that Casseroli is, nobody would classify him as fervently Catholic and as pastoral in approach. Casseroli is a politician, cleric, who's been at this job for a long, long time, and who would like to claim that it was his breakthrough when the Pope met Gorbachev. It wasn't actually. It was John Paul II's achievement, and his alone. To assess Cardinal Agostino Casaroli is very difficult for the normal man, because he moves in a world not inhabited by the normal man. Casaroli has been dreaming and planning of gaining access to Eastern Europe, to the Europe of the USSR, for so long, of reconciling East and West, and of a new era completely. He is not in any sense a supporter of capitalism, or of the democratic egalitarianism, as we call it in the United States and in Canada. He is not of that ilk at all. He is much more inclined to think of another world order, a new world order, arranged along the lines of harmony and brotherly relationships and universal peace, none of which really are Catholic ideals, because the Catholic ideal is only realized in a soul that dies and goes to heaven, ultimately. That's the only one. His policy has been steadily pro-reconciliation, pro-cultivation of the Marxist world, and it hasn't cohered very well with John Paul's geopolitics and his concept of what the church should be. Any discussion of details of Archbishop Cardinal Casaroli's life and administration enters too much into the security of the Vatican, and enters too much into the security surrounding John Paul II, and is best left unsaid. But the judgment on him, my judgment on him, is rather negative, because there is no doubt about it that he has maneuvered the church in a way, both behind the scenes before he became Secretary of State and since he was Secretary of State, in a way that is not inspired by the idea that Christ must be the king of the whole world, or is the king of the whole world, and his kingship must be vindicated. That's the main grumble and grouse that I would have about Archbishop Casaroli as such.
Are there any other key players in Rome that we should discuss?
Well, there's none that have effective power. There was a man who has become a cardinal ever since, Silvestrini, Cardinal Silvestrini now, who was another grey eminence working in the Secretariat of State, who I think at one time wished to, and perhaps he does still wish, to succeed Casaroli, because Casaroli is coming to the end of his term. He is 75. He should be offering his resignation. He may be allowed to stay on. That is, it may be impossible for John Paul II to shift him. But Silvestrini was another grey eminence who again directed the church in its foreign policy along paths that don't cohere with the pastoral and the supernatural mission of the church. You see, all these men are priests. All these men are clerics. All these men are supposedly devoted to the kingdom of Jesus. All these men are supposed to spend their waking hours, and some of their sleeping hours, working at that. But an examination of the administrative decisions they make and have made, and of the men they appoint, of the policies they implement, of the strategies they adopt, don't point to men who are laboring for the kingdom of God. They point to politicians who are looking for the aggrandizement of some worldly power, one way or the other. Have some of them been bought? Yes. We think some of them have been bought. Have some of them merely been corrupted by power? Yes. We think some of them have been corrupted by power. Have some of them sold out to the enemy? Doubtless there are people who have sold out to the enemy, because that's the only way you can explain certain things. Minor details, for instance, as the conclave that elected John Paul II met on Saturday, October 14, 1978. He was elected on October 16. There was no agreement on that Sunday between the two main factions in the conclave. But listen to this as a point of what we know can happen in the Vatican. So they went to bed that night with no pope and no prospect of a pope. And then the next morning, suddenly throughout the whole conclave, Cardinal Karol Wojtyła's name from Krakow, Poland, started rising to everybody's lips. And he obviously was going to be elected pope. They had to arrange things and talk over it, but that was it. The first people to know that was the Polish Communist Politburo in Warsaw. Now wait a moment. The conclave is locked up. There's electronic surveillance. Nobody can communicate with anybody. how did the Polish Politburo know that Karol Wojtyła was going to be Pope? Would be announced the next day. They did. So there are people who are bought, people high up, and it is inevitable. It was always the way. But in this world of ours, where the combat is very close, and where the enemies are very, very intense, this is a very, very serious thing. And especially when you have a man like John Paul II walking on the edge of a cliff all his life as Pope, this is very, very serious. So he's not, in other words, at home in his own house. And even though he has brought Poles in his entourage, a lot of Poles in, and a lot of friends in, he still is face to face with the general bureaucracy, and the habits already formed, and the friendships already formed, and he can do nothing about them.
Is there much corruption in Rome?
Yes, there is. Not an enormous amount. Not an enormous amount. Any egregious sexual corruption is immediately killed off and people are ejected. That's not tolerated for very long at all. You'd never have what we have in the United States, bishops with a homosexual priest companion perpetually with them. That would be impossible. The occasional priest or monsignore or parish priest with a mistress in the country, yes, it does exist. We know it exists. Priests who go to brothels, I'm sure they do. I don't know any instance, but I'd be very surprised if they didn't. Money corruption, yes, a lot of money corruption, because there's a lot of money floating around. And there's the Vatican Bank, which is a great source of revenue for a lot of people. And yes, there's a lot of that corruption, but the real corruption is the corruption of power, the cruelty of power, the wielding of bureaucratic power to pave your own way, climb over dead bodies, bite the hand that fed you, and in general succeed the man who helped you stand up in the first place. Yes, there's a lot of that.
What is sad, it seems, is that a lot of this raw use of power doesn't really take into account the feelings of the lay people out there who are trying to practice their faith under very difficult circumstances.
No, it doesn't take that into account at all. There's no feeling in Rome for that at all. In the higher echelons, they're cut off from it. They're not ordinary people. They have no problem.
So they're living in a world of their own.
That's right. That's right. They are just as the people in Washington live, in our bureaucracy, live in a world of their own too. They don't know what happens in Peoria, Illinois, even though they go there, so to speak. But they don't even go there. They can't go to the Universal Church in Rome. They live apart from it. Now, balance it all by saying there are hundreds of holy men and women in Rome, priests and religious and nuns, hundreds of them. None of them occupy high posts. Holiness is not compatible with that sort of bureaucratic life. It's simply not compatible. You can't stand it. You can't take the lies. You can't take the deceptions. You can't suffer the ambitions, which has nothing to do with the salvation of men. It's purely and simply human ambition, and vanity, and pride, and factionalism, and divisiveness, and gain, and advantage, and the pride of life, and good eating, and good living, and traveling at the Holy See's expense. So it has nothing to do with salvation.
Let's take it back to the laity, though, who are trying to work out their salvation.
Yes.
Many of them see these abuses in the parishes and in the diocese. And so they sit down and write to a cardinal, quite often Cardinal Ratzinger.
Yeah.
And they'll send all kinds of documentation about these abuses.
Yes.
And then they don't hear back. Nothing gets done.
That's right. And Rome loves it. Rome loves it. Because as long as it has the papers, that's all that matters. Now, any deviation from rule, any revolt is what they can't stand. But they don't mind all the letters and the paperasseries, the French call it. Rome is full of paper. And there's no difficulty there. But the idea of taking up what the little widow in North Carolina has written about what the parish priest doesn't or does do, oh no, that's like me climbing beneath the closet to kill a fly. You know, it's not their concern. They're not concerned about that. And de facto, the little widow in North Carolina who does write that letter, what she has to do is to pray and put up with it all, because that's the way the church structure has been built. And until God changes it, we've got to put up with it. That's our cross. And we've got to pray for it. There's no change. There's no change in the offing even in that. That's not going to change. And I know organizations of men and women in this country that have gone to Rome, a whole group of them, financed themselves, and they've written out their objections, complaints, and difficulties, and they've gold embossed the book, and they wait for the card, and they put it into his hand, and they receive his blessing, and they get a letter about a week later saying that His Eminence has read it, and he feels that the church is blessed by having such fervent Christians. Period. Full stop. That's it. And Rome is delighted. These people are faithful to them. They come to them with their complaints. Nothing is going to be done about it. Rome is never afraid of paper. Paper is never frightened of it. Rome is only frightened by a man like Archbishop Lefebvre, who says, I'm going to consecrate 4 bishops.
Let's take a look at the Lefebvre issue and others as well. It seems almost as if Rome is, on the one hand, protecting some of the bad people out in the field. You have all kinds of heretical theologians, and nothing is done about them. And yet you have, let's say, people, traditionalists, like Archbishop Lefebvre or Father Nicholas Gruner, and every attempt is made to suppress them.
Well, take Archbishop Lefebvre and compare him, say, with probably the outstanding heretic today, Hans Kung. Or, well, since Hans Kung has been declared a non-Catholic theologian, let's take Charlie Curran or Walter Casper. They don't consider Walter Casper a danger or Charles Curran a danger for one reason only. He didn't challenge their power. He's just talking theology, and who cares about that? Archbishop Lefebvre said, I'm going to validly consecrate 4 bishops with jurisdiction. That's a challenge in power. He has challenged canonical power. Now, their answer was to take out the howitzer and blow him out of the water. That's why they put forward this excommunication of Lefebvre. He challenged their authority. Whereas they're not going to challenge Walter Casper or Charlie Curran for the simple reason that there's no threat there.
So Rome does not feel threatened by heresy anymore. It doesn't see things as much in theological or ideological terms in the new church.
No, it only sees it in terms of power. Partly because a lot of people in Rome share the heretical views. They're no longer Catholic. And partly because those who are Catholic would like to do something about it haven't got the power to do anything about it. They can't muster the signatures to get a Charles Curran condemned or a Walter Casper removed from his bishop's chair. So the only thing left that they do value is their power, their jurisdiction, and that resides in a bishop who can consecrate priests. And therefore that's why they ultimately turned on Archbishop Lefebvre and sent out this bill of excommunication against him.
And that's why they don't, let's say, send out a bill of excommunication against Charles Curran.
That's right. That's right. He does not bother them. He bothers the local people. He bothers me. He bothers anybody who's listened to him talking or read his books or studied his life. But that doesn't bother Rome an awful lot. It bothers, but they regard it as something which is passing. It doesn't challenge their position. Whereas their jurisdiction and their power, that's their soul. That's their soul.
Now, we've discussed the infighting going on in Rome. Is this infighting mainly based on power, or is it 2 ideological camps?
Based on power, based on 2 camps of power, or 2 camps fighting for power, both camps differing in their beliefs. One is Catholic in the traditional sense. The other is neo-Catholic and is not Catholic any longer in the traditional sense. It's neo-Catholic. It wants that loose aggregation of communities all over the world that profess to be Catholic and honor the Pope as the honorable chairman with a casting vote amongst peers, amongst equals. But the centralized church of Petrine authority is no longer their ideal. In fact, it is ancient and outmoded as a way of looking at the church's government. That is a pity. It means that the infallibility of the Pope, the primacy of the Pope is challenged. They're both dogmas of faith. These people say, well, it must be reinterpreted. Of course he's infallible under certain circumstances. Of course he has primacy under certain circumstances. But we must redefine that in the face of new realities, which means that he's not infallible and he has got no primacy.
But they phrase it in such a way that they can get out of what they're really
yes,
trying to say.
They're always trying to get a new understanding of something. It's not quite what you fellas say, they will say. It's something else. Of course he's infallible, certain infallibility, and he has a certain primacy. But it's not what you call it. It's not what you say it is.
And they're very clever.
Oh, they're extremely clever. They hold on, and spread it throughout the church. I think if you were to ask, go around, say, the parishes of these United States, there are about 400, 500 parishes in the whole country. But no, more than that, but whatever number there are, I think you'd find that rarely does anybody preach about the infallibility of the Pope or the primacy of the Pope, and most people don't believe it any longer, just as they don't believe in the real presence of Christ in the Blessed Eucharist any longer. It's symbolical. You can't exaggerate too much. It's not cannibalism. We're not eating Christ. It must be much more human and modern and scientific and reasonable for modern people. How can you say you eat Christ in the Blessed Eucharist? How can you say the Pope can command people in Texas to do what he says? The world is too large. He can't decide for every nation and every ethnic group and every race and every culture. So they finesse everything to the point that the ancient dogmas fly out the window or are torn to tatters.
And of course one of these is the Petrine authority. Let's take a look perhaps a bit closer at this present Pope and what his strengths and what his weaknesses are.
Yeah, his strengths are manifest and his weaknesses are manifest. John Paul II's strength is that he has not yet once violated one rule of faith. He has not yet once said or taught anything which is against faith. And that's an awful lot to say for a clergyman today. He has proven, therefore, to be totally Catholic. Where his weaknesses lie is in his effort to compromise as much as possible so as to divert any trouble from his head, because he has enough trouble already. And there he has, I think, made prudential mistakes. When he found out they had arranged, for instance, the day of Assisi, if you remember, in 1986,
yes,
he should have said, I'm not going. He didn't. He went along. He didn't arrange it. They arranged it. He should have refused to go along with it. When he found out that they were out to kill off Archbishop Lefebvre, he said, no, I'm going to Econ myself, he should have said, and done, and gone. He should have reconciled with Lefebvre. It was very easy. Or put it off, put off the evil day. He didn't. Trouble. He couldn't deal with it. He had too much trouble. And you could go down through a long list of things of that nature where he has failed to settle questions. For instance, the whole question of religious liberty. He should have decided that. It's a burning question in the church, and various people are giving their opinions about it. The general idea nowadays amongst the neo-Catholics is that you're free to do what you like. You're free to practice error. That's your human right. But you must be sincere in it. The church has always denied that. No man is free to choose error. No man is free to choose error. And you can't say that people are free to be what they like. They're not. They have to come to Christ through the Catholic Church. That is Catholic doctrine, because outside the church there is no salvation. He hasn't clarified that issue. He hasn't taken the burning issues, therefore, of Vatican II and cleared up the ambivalence. Ambivalence about collegiality, ambivalence about religious liberty, ambivalence about the Mass. What finally is a valid Mass? What finally is a valid Mass in the name of God? He hasn't cleared it up. On those 3 points, there is weaknesses. He has not cleared them up. Obviously, he has decided that he'd better not touch them. It's a hornet's nest. It's too much trouble. It's danger. It's peril for him. Nor has he cleaned up the point about Petrine authority. Is he really finally primate of the church? Has he really got the primacy? Because he doesn't exercise it. What does Vatican II say about it? It's ambivalent. It can be interpreted. And they have interpreted it in the anti-Petrine way. He hasn't cleared that up. That's bad. Then there's the big difficulty, which can be poignant. I'm sure he wakes up at 2 o'clock in the morning sweating over this one. It's the following. If I'm head of this house, and there's a large group of people living in the house, and I know there are 3 men there who go out at night and they mug and kill people. I know that. I don't do anything about it. I am guilty. I'm guilty of what they do. Because I know it, I have the authority to stop them, and I don't. John Paul II knows that there are blasphemies committed in parishes. He knows that certain bishops are homosexuals and living openly as such. He knows that certain ordinations are invalid, and if he doesn't, he should, but he does. He does nothing about it. Hey, in normal terms, he'd be guilty of the same sins by indirection. He does nothing about it because he has judged that that would bring a storm on his head and wipe him out.
So for the time being, he's trying to paper over these divisions in order to keep peace.
Yeah. Is that the wisest course? Is that really Christian? Is that really Christ-like? I don't know. I wouldn't like to have to make that decision. Because when the Jesuits tolerated Father Drinan in the Congress of the United States, who pushed abortion funding, for 10 years they did nothing about him. And therefore the Jesuit general and the local superiors here, the superior of this house, were all guilty of the same sins. Finally, John Paul II said, get out of politics. He did. Not because he was pushing abortion funding, he didn't mention that. He said because priests shouldn't be in politics. He attained the same result, but with a different mode. But in the meantime, Jesuit superiors were guilty of it. The Jesuit superiors who tolerated Marxist Jesuits in Nicaragua were guilty of the sins of those priests. That's common morality and common law, by the way. So John Paul runs the risk of being guilty of sins committed by his permissiveness. And that is grave. That's very grave, because Christ is going to say to him, you knew these things were happening. Why didn't you do your damnedest? If they killed you, so what? They kill me. What's killing got to do with it? That's the difficulty about it. Now, John Paul's judgment is he's got to wait, hold on, because the alternative is worse. He thinks. He's got to hold on until Our Lady comes. But that brings us to the whole outlook, vision, and policy of Jesus. What he's about. What is he about? In the beginning, when he started his papal trips, people say, well, why doesn't he just stay at home and administer the church? Clean up the mess, scour out the Augean stables, wash away these things, attend to details, master the congregations, enter into the politics of the Vatican, cut off heads, reform, renewal. He didn't. He insists on going abroad. He's going to Mexico this year, amongst other things, and he's going to the Soviet Union, and he's been on 44 trips, I don't know how many countries, speaking in so many languages, and he's going to go on traveling and tripping around as Pope in that white Alitalia DC-10. Why? Well, he has said so on several occasions. Why? He has said that Our Lady wishes him to act in such a way that the maximum number of human beings will have seen him in the flesh or in TV image and heard his voice with their ears or on audio before she comes. He has a reason for it. Secondly, there is the fact that from all that can be made out, from all that can be discerned, it will be during one of those trips that Our Lady comes, if we won't be in Rome when it takes place. And thirdly, his attitude is this. The world is rushing into a new world order. They're going to have a world structure. I want to be the most prominent man alive, and he is. Do you realize that in the whole 6,000 years of known history, we have never known one man who was seen by 3.5 billion people and heard by about 4 billion people? Only John Paul II is the only man alive we know about whom that can be said. So he's achieved an international profile of high intensity. He's the one man who can be identified by anybody, black, white, or sky blue, pink, east, west, north, south, Chinese, or Western, or Russian. Everybody knows John Paul II, the first pope in history, the first man in history, totally identifiable by pygmies in the forest, by businessmen in Wall Street, by junk traders in Hong Kong, by anybody. They know this man. He set out to achieve that. And he said that he did that because at the moment that they approach the superstructure, he will have a say as the vicar of Christ.
So he's anticipating the New World Order then?
Yeah.
Let's take a look a bit at his Marian devotion or his Marian theology. It seems to play a large role in what he's doing.
Yeah, he is his motto, as you know, is totus tuus, which means you're a complete slave. And he's talking about Our Lady. He's convinced about Fatima, that the Fatima promise is going to take place during his lifetime as Pope. He's convinced, in other words, that the curse of Fatima, as it's called jocularly, that is, as you know, the third secret Our Lady predicted there would be calamities. Whole sections of the continents would be washed away forever. Whole nations would perish. There would be natural catastrophes that would level humanity. She has promised that. She said that's going to happen. You can't mitigate it, the Pope says. It's going to happen anyway. And that whole nations would lose their faith. Now, he believes that firmly, that it's going to take place like that. And hence one reason for him to be a sign of salvation on that day. If people remember his face, remember his voice, that God will give them the grace on that day to lift their eyes to heaven and say, have mercy on us, and be converted. That's his outlook on it all. And there's a lot to support him in that. And this is the chariot, the motor that drives him in his work and in his perseverance, because any other man would have been broken by what he's been through. I mean, if you have been shot at like he has and felt hot lead in your body, have been laid low by people you know, I think after that you'd retire and lead a very quiet life and administer your parish wherever you are and stay quiet. John Paul hasn't stopped. He hasn't stopped in Poland, he hasn't stopped in Russia, he hasn't stopped in Europe, he hasn't stopped in the Americas, he hasn't stopped in Asia. He's still going stronger and stronger every day, and has more influence every day of the week. He increases his influence, and is accepted amongst the secular leaders of our world as somebody so agile in diplomacy, so expert, so knowledgeable, they can't do without him. There are 116 nations now have embassies at His Holy See in Rome, and they insist on having it for information, for influence, for his counsel, for his general power. And this man hasn't got an army. So it has paid off in that sense. But his idea is that he is an instrument of Our Lady, and of Our Lady of Fatima. In other words, he's going to assist at the conversion of Russia. And he doesn't call the present movement in Russia a conversion at all. It's a Leninist plot. Gorbachev being a hardcore Leninist thinker. That's his attitude to Our Lady. He is tenderly devoted to Our Lady. He has a great devotion to her, had always, is consecrated to her, has consecrated Poland with Cardinal Wyszynski in his day, back in the 1960s, and has consecrated the world to Our Lady, and is waiting for the time that he will be allowed to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart. He says he's not allowed at the present moment. So he's totally devoted to Our Lady. In that, he's made many enemies. When he wrote, for instance, a letter in February 1982 telling the bishops that he wanted to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, some of them never answered him. Some, like Cardinal Hume, answered and said that they couldn't propose that to people. They would be scandalized by it. Can you imagine a bishop writing that to the Pope? They did, though. And they regard him as a Polish bishop who's gone astray and ended up as Pope in the church when he should be in a diocese in Krakow in Poland, hidden away. Got him meddling with affairs that he shouldn't meddle with, and imposing his conservative views on a church which is trying desperately to advance and join humanity and be part of the human race. So he has enemies, dire enemies, who would like to see him dead and out of office. And failing his death by human hand, or failing getting him out of office, they want him to retire. After all, he's 70. 5 more years. He, by the way, according to canon law, can retire, resign, and nobody need ask him a reason, and he'd give a reason to nobody. It's in canon law. And they would like him to declare 75, but he's retiring because of old age, because of ill health, and because he has outlived his usefulness and he can help the church in other ways, and then put in their own man. But they forget one factor. He is the personal representative of Jesus. And believe me, Bernard, there's nobody more vengeful than Jesus when it comes to what belongs to him. And there's nothing he prizes more than his church. And nothing in the church he prizes more than Peter, on whom he built the church. And those who are now tampering with the papacy and tampering with the Petrine office and planning to get rid of the last man who stands as a guard over it, They are facing a Christ who is full of wrath and anger, not forgiveness, not compassion. You have touched the very reason he came on earth. And that promises for them a terrible punishment. Also for us, because we happen to belong in the same caravan in history. But the caravan which is wending its way towards a crossroads where I think the times of Satan are finished, and we're going to see a time of surcease and peace for the church for a while, until the last big struggle comes. And that's Antichrist. And that's the end of all.
Thank you, Father, for participating in these interviews, and I hope they have been helpful to our listeners.
Thank you very much, Bernard. It's been a pleasure. It really has.
Does Pope John Paul II have a plan for making the Roman Catholic Church a global power by the year 2000? That's the claim of at least one author this morning as we match steel on steel. A hearty good morning to you all. This is Steel on Steel, a weekly broadcast dedicated to the sharpening of ideas. I'm John Leffler, and my engineer this morning is Sean Kelly. Our guest for today's broadcast, live by telephone from New York City, is Dr. Malachi Martin, who is author of a newly released book entitled The Keys of This Blood, the struggle for world dominion between Pope John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the capitalist West. And so to start off, I'd like to say good morning, Dr. Martin, or actually good afternoon to you.
Good morning, John, or good afternoon. Really, in God's world, it doesn't matter. The sun is still moving around and we're moving around. It's all the same. It's God's day.
That's pretty true. You know, I'm really delighted to have you available for the program. Ever since I began reading your books a number of years ago, I always thought, well, this is a gentleman I would like to sit down and have coffee with. And it's not quite coffee, and we're 1,500 miles apart, but at least we're both sitting down, I assume. So.
That's right. And space and time, and we are telescoped when we're talking on communication.
That's really true. With me today in the studio, Dr. Martin, is also Kathleen Hayes. She is publisher of a national newsletter called The Trumpet. Good morning, Kathleen.
Yes. Correspondent. Good morning, Kathleen.
How are you, Dr. Martin?
I am fine. It's lovely to hear your voice. I hope you got what I sent you.
Yes, and thank you very much.
No, thank you for getting in touch with me.
Dr. Martin, you've published about 15 books, I think, over the past 2 decades. Many of these deal with the Roman Catholic Church.
Yes.
Some of these were fiction, such as Vatican and Final Conclave.
The really, John, the Vatican was faction, as they called it in the trade.
Faction.
That is, yeah, they call it faction. You know what they call it faction? Because you use fictional names for real people to protect their innocence, to protect their feelings, to protect your kneecaps. But it's really a description of what the author thinks happened between 1929 and 1978. It's a faction, in other words.
So the story is true, but the names have been changed to protect the innocent.
That's the general idea of a faction.
Well, you also had some other books that were generally more historical than fiction,
yes.
like the Jesuits and the Betrayal of the Roman Catholic Church.
That's right.
And a lot of these would seem to be a concerted attack on Catholicism or some of the faux pas of its papacy.
That's right. But you know, John, the general idea in those historical surveys was to show what had happened in the past, the lessons to be drawn from that about getting rid of any imperialism and any notion of political domination in the Roman Catholic Church, which used to be the great fear of American Protestants in particular, that any move of Catholicism towards the White House or any elaboration of Catholics within the civic and the federal system of the states would herald the Pope's domination of our political life and the taking away of our rights.
I understood, which was a genuine fear at the time.
It was a genuine fear, and I must tell you that part of my education when I became an American in 1971, I came over in 1965, but it took 5 years to make sure that I was thoroughly Americanized. The part of my education was to find out there was a genuine fear and a genuine suspicion of Roman Catholic motives, which had not been dispelled really by the election of JFK.
Understood.
It hadn't been quite dispelled, and it still exists. In fact, between you and me and Kathleen and your listeners, one of the most profound nativist prejudices amongst native-born Americans still is a certain lurking fear of Catholicism.
Let me drag it back over to the topic of the book here.
Yes.
Our listeners don't know yet what we're talking about. The Keys of This Blood basically maintains, as I read it, and I force-read it yesterday on like a forced march, struggle for world dominion between Pope John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the capitalist West. And you have maintained that these three powers are locked in a struggle for some form of global domination. By the year 2000, we're actually moving towards a global world government.
We are, yes. And where to start is something I'd rather you choose. The first thing I think would be to emphasize for those who are listening the fact that willy-nilly, and not through the machinations of either Gorbachev or the plans of John Paul II or the plans of our capitalist West, willy-nilly, the world of man, that is the society of nations, is moving towards a one-world economic system and a one-world government.
Ready or not.
Ready or not, willing or not. Why? I think it's mainly, it's of course within the plans of the God I worship and the Christ I hope for as my Savior, but it's also within the mechanism of human commerce. Today, for instance, no nation can exist without trading. You perish beneath the waves, and that's what's happened. That bedraggled Robin Hood of the Caribbean, Mr. Fidel Castro. He finds that without active trade, he's going to perish. And may that day come, may I say in parentheses, too.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Given that situation, why would Pope John Paul II even have a shot at any kind of global domination?
Because I'll tell you, as the preacher emphasized, who was preaching just before we came on, the real power in this world is the power that controls men's wills and fills their minds with the ideas and the notions that you, the propagandist or the communicator, has. That's the purpose of all commercial activity, commercials, of all advertising and propaganda and publicity, to get at people's will. That's the real power. With having that in hand, then you can do an awful lot. And John Paul II's aim is to attract the wills of men to his own ideas of salvation and honesty and compassion and civilization and peace, and to fill them with notions drawn from the Christian heritage, which he shares with all Christians. Now, similarly, on his part, Mr. Gorbachev has his range of ideas and principles, and he also wants to attract our wills to go his way. And similarly with the capitalist class, to which you and I and Kathleen and everybody belongs in America, we have our ideas of democratic egalitarianism and the attached moral values of that. So it's really power in this world finally comes down to the power over men's wills and over their minds. And it's in that arena that John Paul II has been working for 12 years and is still working, and is quite confident that in the end, once the time for an idea has come, and once the time for wills to be turned in one direction has come, nothing, neither armies, nor power, nor money, nor persecution, and no governmental pressure can change it.
How are other world leaders responding to this?
Well, I'll tell you, the first stage in John Paul II's campaign to do something along these lines consisted in his establishing himself with a high international profile. In 6,000 years of history, we know about 6,000 years of history rather detailedly now. And we only know one man, and one man only, who has been seen in the flesh and heard his living voice, either through audio or video, or in the flesh, and that is John Paul II. He's been heard by over 3.5 billion people, speaking in 45 languages in 91 countries. His stature is unparalleled. There is nobody like it today. Even Mr. Gorby, as we all have come to call him, whether we're speaking German or French or English or Arabic, hasn't got that notoriety, that high profile. And there's no one today that doubts for a moment John Paul II's compassion and disinterest in politics. Everybody knows he's not looking for money or gold or pleasure. They know him as a world figure who's continually pleading for the running sores and wounds of our civilization, the homeless, the poor, the depressed, the ill, the oppressed. So he has built up that. Now he's in the second stage, and that is his close collaboration with world governments as a spiritual and moral advisor. And he has one advantage, which they all recognize, and it's this. The Vatican has, for one reason or another, mainly historical, it has a passionless objectivity and a supply of data that makes its intelligence so accurate and so valuable that 117 governments have their embassies on Vatican Hill beside him just to benefit by the perception of Vatican intelligence.
What mandate did Pope John Paul feel he had to do this? By, like, if I were to say, on whose authority is he doing this?
Well, I'll tell you, on two grounds, under two headings, really. He does regard himself, being the Pope and being the 263rd successor to St. Peter over a period of 2,000 years, he does feel that on him has fallen the mantle of moral and religious leader for all men. Moral and religious, not political, not imperial, not financial, not commercial, not political, not economic, but moral and spiritual. And secondly, then he himself, in 1981, after the attempted assassination in St. Peter's, he had, he says, and maintains quite calmly and easily, a special revelation designing him and telling him that within his lifetime, within this decade, he would be authenticated as such a moral and religious leader.
Okay, how would this authentication occur?
Well, quite frankly, however fantastic it may seem to some of our listeners, by a sign in the heavens, by a clear happening that all men, whether they're in New York or Denver or in jungle clearing in Tasmanian jungles or in Singapore or Beijing, all men would know that he had this role and destiny. It would not mean they'd all become Roman Catholics, but it would identify him as the bearer of this role.
Okay, now if we're talking about a sign in the heavens, are we talking about something with the sun, such as happened at Fatima?
We don't know. John, there you have me. We don't know, and he has not said. But apparently it's an irremovable sign once it appears. It's visible to all men. It will do no harm, but it will vivify every man's conscience, the conscience of every man and woman. And they will know then that there is a focal point on this globe where he is, where he lives. For the moment it's Rome, the Vatican in Italy, in the Mediterranean, and that there is a man whose role is that. But that's supposed to coincide with an engulfing chaos and misdirection and disequilibrium in human affairs. And sometimes, John, when I look at what's happening, both East and West, especially in the Gulf, especially in China and Russia, and especially in Latin America, and sometimes when I look at my beloved America, because I love this country, I begin to think that we are at the beginning of that unraveling of the human thing, when we will all be wanting and will need a solution from on high.
The mandate that John Paul has more directly came from, from his vision in Fatima, or he had a repetition, of the vision of Fatima?
That's right. That's right. He had a repetition of this happening in Fatima in 1917, October 13. What happened briefly there was, and by the way, let's first of all note that it was witnessed by 75,000 people.
Right. It
was witnessed by photographers and newsmen.
And many of them non-believers.
Well, most of the newsmen were anti-Catholic.
Right.
Because they belonged to newspapers in Lisbon and in Spain and France who were out there to make a joke of the whole thing. And they took photographs, and they wrote articles immediately about it. And there were observers as far away as America and the Far East and Africa and Northern Europe. So the testimony as to what happened is without a shadow of a doubt in it. There's no fake here. But what they saw was the sun at midday, precisely at midday, as it was predicted in May of that year. In May of that year, the three people who were the instruments for this revelation, for this happening, predicted that on October 13 this would happen. What happened was the sun seemed to stop and then to whirl around in a very funny way and to, as it were, dance between the clouds, shooting off every color in the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And then after that to start pulsating like a huge heart. And then a third phase, it started to rush down at the people, frightening them. Many of them cried out they were going to die. The heat became intense. and then suddenly it stopped halfway and went back to its normal orbit. And incidentally, by the way, it had been waiting for 3 days, and the 75,000 people took about 5 days to get there. Everybody was drenched in their clothes. When the sun had stopped its gyrations and gone back to its normal orbit, everybody's clothes were dry and smelt as if they'd just come from the laundry. And this is all testified. It's not imagination.
And this was October 13th, 1917.
That's right.
We have to take a break here, Dr. Martin. We'll be back in about a minute. You're listening to Steel on Steel this morning, and we're interviewing Dr. Malachi Martin, who is author of The Keys of This Blood, The Struggle for World Dominion Between Pope John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the Capitalist West. Back in a moment. When people wish to buy or sell a home, oftentimes they wonder whether or not their realtor really works for them. According to Steve Lang at Lang Realty,
before you make a move to buy or sell a home, talk to a realtor at Lang Realty. You have an advantage when your realtor represents you throughout your transaction. Talk to Lang Realty about their exclusive representation throughout your home purchase or sale. Call 422-4812.
Remember that Lang Realty distinguishes itself because it really cares about the people it serves. The number again there is 422-4812.
K-Light.
Good morning. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. I'm John Leffler. With me is Kathleen Hayes, and we're interviewing Dr. Malachi Martin, who is author of Keys of This Blood, which is a new book out from Simon & Schuster. We were talking about the apparition at Fatima and the miracle which occurred there on October 13th, 1917.
John, the connection between John Paul II and that was, first of all, that he had a repetition of that himself. And, by the way, in the actual square, when Mehmet Ali Agca, his intended assassin, aimed his Browning automatic at John Paul II, he aimed 2 bullets at his skull casing and 2 bullets at his torso. And he fired off the first 2 bullets at the Pope's skull casing. But at that precise moment, John Paul II bent down to pick up a little child. Why? Because the little child had pinned to its blouse. She was the daughter of a carpenter from Avellino, just outside Rome. She had pinned to her blouse a small little picture of the Virgin of Fatima.
Right.
And the bullets passed over his head and struck 2 American tourists.
This was also the anniversary of the first apparition, May 13th.
That's right. It was. So everything in John Paul II's mind was connected, and then he went back and read the basic documents connected with Fatima and came to his conclusions, and that really divided up his pontificate. From then on, he knew that he had a shorter time to live, that there was a shorter time for him to achieve what he had set out to achieve, and that the sign of the Virgin, the sign of Fatima, the sign of a new era in the human condition, would take place very shortly.
Okay, so we now have some sort of a modus operandi for the Pope. Mm-hmm. How does Pope John Paul feel about the books you have written, like this one here? Does he see these manuscripts before you release them?
Well, that would be talking out of court, John, but nothing is ever published. There's no censorship on me. There's nobody tells me, don't write this, don't write that. I'm an American, and I'm a Roman Catholic priest, and I know what I shouldn't write and what I should write. But the contents are always made known beforehand.
Does he agree afterwards with what you say?
Well, I've never heard of disagreement yet. Put it like that.
Okay, so basically it's sort of a neutral commitment there.
That's right. That's right. He leaves me with that liberty, provided I don't err in dogma or morals.
Fine.
Or tell lies.
I understand. Kathleen has a question for you.
Yes, Kathleen.
Well, first of all, Dr. Martin, let me compliment you on the book. It's remarkable in that it gets the reader into the mind of this man, John Paul, his background, his objectives, and more importantly, you really allow the reader to see how this very complex man works, the mental machinations of John Paul II.
That's right.
As he has scrutinized his opponents and classified them, and how he analyzes. He's obviously a very, very intelligent man. I think that is the book's strength, Dr. Martin.
That is the strength, all right.
The other part, as you alluded to earlier, in that you said that the Vatican has perhaps the best intelligence-gathering network of any in the world. I would have thought that Israel's Mossad, but in any case, I found the book extremely interesting. But, Dr. Martin, I do have some real concerns, and
yes,
I'm sure you've heard these before from other people as you've gone around the country to promote the book.
Yes.
let me go back maybe a couple thousand years. Jesus Christ said to us that, one, there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations. That was Luke 21.
That's right.
He warned that any visions or things in the sky, celestial signs, were not good. He also said in that false Christs and false prophets shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect.
That's right.
If it were possible, Matthew
That's right.
24. Another time, the Lord is speaking, he says, it is a wicked and an adulterous generation that would seeketh after a sign. There shall be no sign given it, Matthew 16.
Yes.
Another place, in Revelations, we are told that demonic spirits, or it says the spirits of devils, can work miracles.
Yes, right.
All right, with that as laying a foundation for where I'm going to come from,
Yes.
how we have no guarantee. In fact, we have from the mouth of the Lord Jesus Christ that these sun signs are not of God.
Mm-hmm.
What is your comment?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a little element there which I must bring in, Catherine, which you will understand, and which I don't expect you necessarily at all or readily to accept. And it is this, that some of those quotations must be referred to the generation in which our Lord lived. The wicked and adulterous generation he was talking about was, I think, normally taken by Catholic exegetes anyway, as his contemporaries were looking for a sign to get them out of the difficulties they had with Roman occupation. But to go on to the general question, the element I want to introduce is this, that there is a certain surety and guarantee for Catholics anyway in the Pope's interpretation of events, and we rely upon the Holy Spirit to make sure that the infallibility he has, the guidance he has, will protect him from error. Now, admittedly, and here every Catholic of any common sense would admit, any man, Pope included, can be deceived. But what Catholic theology and perception has always said is this: look, in order to discern the good of a thing or the bad of a thing, you must see its effects. If it promotes sin, if it promotes separation from God, if it separates you from the truth of revelation, then no matter how attractive and how impressive it is, then it's from Satan, it's from the bad. If in general it promotes the good, it promotes obedience and humility and compassion, observance of the law, and seeking of the kingdom of God in this life as a preparation for eternal life forever in heaven, then it's good, it's from God as such. Now there's no element in John Paul's life or teaching which suggests for one moment that he is under the influence of some demonic power.
Well, but sometimes, Dr. Martin, we don't always know that. The fruit looks good, and we don't know for several years. Let me get off that topic if I could, and I'm going to probably butcher some Polish names.
That's all right.
It's Irisher to Irisher here, so help me. Cardinal Stefan, is it Wyszynski? Wyszynski.
That's right.
All right.
You got it.
He, I understand from your book, was John Paul's mentor for the better part of 30 years.
Right.
And it was he who taught the Pope to be the geopolitical genius he is today.
That's right. He schooled him.
Yes. Now, in the book, I think somewhere around page 616, you talk about this relationship that these two men had,
yes.
And that at the time when John Paul was elected Pope on October 16, 1978,
yes.
Let me go back and quote you quoting Cardinal. I'm going to say Cardinal Stephen because I'm going to make a mess of his name if I don't.
No, you're
fine.
All
right, it said, you have him saying that if anything is a miracle, what happened in the Sistine Chapel on October 16 is one.
Yes.
The Cardinal goes on to say, when I approached John Paul II to pay my first homage, he and I almost simultaneously pronounced Our Lady of Jasnagora. This was her work, so we believed, and so we decidedly still believe.
Yes. Right.
In another place, Cardinal Stephen is speaking, and he says that he believes that the whole constitution of the church is at once Christocentric and Marian, and then he also says that he's calling down Mary's blessings on his brother cardinals.
That's right.
And using the title, quote, the Poles had always conferred on her the Lady of Jasna of the Bright Mountain, because she is from Poland.
Right.
And then on page 616, you have John Paul himself talking to his mentor,
Yes.
and he says, on the throne of Peter today, there would not be a Polish pope if it had not been for your unceasing belief in the Mother of the Church, or if there had not been Jasna Gora.
That's right.
My question to you,
Yes.
Dr. Martin, and from my research,
Yes.
what is the significance that the Lady of Jasna Gora of Czestochowa is a black virgin? Why is she black?
From sheer age and from the fires with which the Huns, the Hussites, and other predators tried to destroy it.
Well,
She's not black. It's not black by wood or anything like that. It's black by usage and abuse.
but in a book that written by Dominican Ian Begg, he says that Catholics pretty much are told that the black virgin is black because of candle smoke or age, and that is not true. He says because the polychromatic clothing that she and the child wear
Yes.
are not soiled, but the faces are. And so if it were smoke or age, it would, I would imagine it would affect all parts of the icon at once.
One would have said so. I frankly, Kathleen, you have me on this point. I've always taken for granted because of the Poles I've talked to and the one side I had of Jasna Gora, the statue, that it was use and abuse. You're quite right. The polychromatic aspect of the picture still remains. And by the way, the face is not completely black at all.
Okay.
It's dark.
Dr. Martin, also, as I understand it, there are probably, at least at one time, were maybe as many as 150 to 190 of these figurines or icons.
Yes.
The research that I've done indicates that the Black Virgin is synonymously the fertility goddess Isis, and in Christian time, Mary Magdalene.
Yes.
Is that your understanding?
No, because, Kathleen, to go back again, I don't think it's a black virgin in that sense of the color. The color is not black. It's a deep brown, blackened here and there. But it obviously was part and parcel of a polychromatic icon itself. The connection with Isis, I think, is one only by coincidence, in the sense that men have always figured out a mother goddess, whether it's the Romans or the Parthians or the Greeks or the Chinese or the Polynesians. It's a common figure in early mythology of the human race. And doubtless the Virgin is the Christian fulfillment of that basic thrust in humanity, mother.
So to John Paul, who is the Lady of Jasna Gora, whom does she represent?
She represents the Virgin, Mary.
Jesus' mother.
That's right.
You're familiar with the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail?
Yes, I am.
Okay. The authors of that book say on page 102
Yes.
that Isis, I'm quoting now, is said to have survived under Christianity in the guise of the Virgin Mary, the Queen of Heaven. They also say that the mother goddess of Christianity would not appear to be the Virgin, meaning Jesus' mother. On the contrary, she would appear to be Magdalene. And that leads me into my next question.
Yes.
Also, I found your last chapter extremely interesting, the consistory.
Yes.
I had difficulty understanding at times because it seems to be almost an extended metaphor or very symbolic, and there were.
Yes.
But in that particular chapter, you talk about, well, you say the dove is loose. The dove is loose. Of what is the dove representative?
The dove was the code name used for the Pope when he was walking unattended by guards. It's a code name used by the security.
Okay.
To get back to that book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the assertion that ISIS persevered in Christianity is purely gratuitous on the part of those two authors. We've had that out with them on radio and television when they came over doing their book tour here. And nobody in Christianity ever, for the first 1,500 years, thought of identifying the Virgin Mary with Isis, or that Isis survived. What did survive, and what was fulfilled by the figure of the Virgin during her life and then after death, when she was assumed into heaven according to a Catholic belief, and the Christian belief for the first 1,500 years, by the way, was that was the basic idea, the centrality of motherhood in the human race based in the family. But the identification with ISIS is purely gratuitous. And as I say, is a gratuitous assertion of those
What
two
about
arguments.
Magdalene? Maybe we can talk about that. I think they're giving me a high sign. Is it time to break?
We have to take a station
Okay.
break here.
Okay, well, we'll get back to it.
We'll be back in just a moment. This is Steel on Steel on a Saturday morning. We are going to have an extra half hour of the program today, so do not go away. Kathleen Hayes and I are interviewing Dr. Malachi Martin, who is author of Keys of This Blood, The Struggle for World Dominion Between Pope John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the Capitalist West. Back in just a moment.
K-Light 80, K-Light, 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 K-Light 80, K-Light, 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 the light of the Rockies, K-Light, the light of the Rockies, KLTT, 80 AM bright Denver, KLTT.
Welcome back to the second half of Steel on Steel, a weekly program dedicated to the sharpening of ideas. I'm John Leffler. With me is Kathleen Hayes, and we're interviewing Dr. Malachi Martin, which I love your name, by the way. I tend to like everything Irish. The mother side of my family was Irish, so Leffler doesn't sound like it, I suppose.
Well, Leffler is a fine name. My name, Malachi, or Malachi, is a combination of an Irish name and then the name of the Hebrew prophet.
Yes.
The minor prophet, the last of the prophets.
Dr. Martin, going
Yes,
back to the consistory,
Yes.
you mentioned in that chapter that there will be three organizations, three groups that will assist the Pope when he comes to power, and you named two. You say that two of them are already familiar. One, the Legionnaires of Christ,
Yes.
and then you mentioned Opus Dei.
Yes.
But you've got me very much interested, and I'm sure many people who have read the book. This third group, you say, is already established and exists on a worldwide basis, but hitherto has remained a total secret.
Yes.
I could play guessing games or think Knights
Yes,
of Columbus,
what's the-
Knights of Malta, but let me ask you this, and I'm basing this on something else I picked up in reading the book. You seem to indicate in broad strokes from time to time in the book that Poland has a messianic role to play.
That's
So
right.
let me ask you this. Could this group, this totally secret group, be the Prieuré de Sion, the Priory of Sion, or the Templars, or whatever name they might be going on now?
Yes. No, Kathleen, actually, it's not. It's something which has sprang out of John Paul II's terrible difficulties at the present moment. The difficulties, what are they? They're this, that his church, the structure of his church, I'm talking about the cardinals, the archbishops, the priests, the monsignori, the parishes, the dioceses, the chanceries, the universities, the schools, the entire functional structure of the Catholic Church is in shambles.
Mm-hmm.
In shambles in what way? In the sense that there is no longer any shred of the unity that used to bind all those elements together in a pyramid of power. It's gone. The bishops do not obey the Pope. The priests do not obey the bishops or the Pope. Lay people in general are split. Either they're with one faction or the other, right, left, and center. The famed unity of the Catholic Church, which was so strong even at the beginning of this century, even at the end of the Second World War and into the 50s, is gone. It's a thing of memory. Now, John Paul II, therefore, has no power in his structure. He's barely holding it together. And he's holding it together by abstaining from doing what a lot of people think he should do, reform it. And he has refused to start any reformation of the evils that have beset his seminaries and his bishops and his priests and his nuns and his layfolk and his churches and his chanceries and his universities and schools.
Why is that?
He says he can't do it. It's gone too far.
Isn't that partially based on a revelation from Mary in the third secret at Fatima?
It is, that he can't do it anyway. But to get on to Kathleen's particular point, in that situation, there has started a network of people, because what now is in danger for Catholics, what now is in danger is the access to a valid Mass and valid Holy Communion and confession and confirmation. The basics of Catholicism are up for grabs, because in many cases there has been substituted for those vital sacramental activities, confession, communion, confirmation, Mass, there has been substituted ceremonies and actions which in no way function in a Catholic way. So looking forward, and by the way, every 6 months it gets worse. And don't be surprised that I say every 6 months and not every year, because every 6 months there's a new breach in Catholicism of this kind. And more people are saying, where can we find a good priest? Where can we find a bishop who's a real pastor and doesn't spend his time talking sexual psychology or politics with the president?
I would also say there's a lot of what is called New Age or occult doctrines which have made their way into
right into it. The thing has been honeycombed and permeated with non-Christian, non-Catholic elements that forebode badly for its survival.
Well, if that's true, though, Dr. Martin, and then if he can't hold the Catholic Church together, how is he going to lead the world? Is it going to be based on this event that's going to happen in the sky?
Well, Kathleen, what he says is this briefly, that when that sign comes, when his authentication comes, it will heal immediately those who are healable. And it will tell those who are not healable, who've lost their Catholic faith, goodbye, reform, or get out. Now, I want to finish the point that I was making apropos of you. There has grown up, therefore, a small network already in many countries throughout the world of men and women who are organized in a quiet way to make sure there's a permanent supply of Catholicism, Catholic sacramental actions, so that it doesn't fade out. Because do you know that in France, there are hundreds of miles of territory in France, the eldest daughter of the church, it used to be called, where you haven't got a church or a convent or a rectory or a school, and where there's no baptized person.
Mm-hmm.
The extent of the shambles is something which most people do not realize.
Just for the sake of record and for the sake of the tape from the show, let me at least define for the audience that the Priory of Sion, the Templars as they were called, believe that they are in possession of certain documents that indicate that Jesus Christ married Mary Magdalene and that they had at least one son and that Jesus' bloodline exists today.
Yes. You realize, Catherine, that's a myth.
Well, I, of course, believe it's heresy, but...
well, it's a myth. It was invented by those two authors and a few others. There's no documentary evidence to prove the existence of the Priory of Sion now.
And yet, if you look at the film, Dr. Martin, The Last Temptation of Christ, that also shows, in a sense, or suggests that Jesus fantasized Mary and Magdalene.
See, Kathleen, look at the only historical record we have of Jesus. Martin Scorsese, in The Last Temptation of Christ, bowdlerized, first of all, the original book by Kazantzakis. He bowdlerized it. He turned a literary work of literary imagination into a supposedly historical, factual account. It is complete myth, really complete myth. There's no foundation for it. But it does lower Jesus to being just a human being.
Right.
And that was the ultimate aim. And that's just the work of Satan.
Well, but I have two things to say. One, in the book, though, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, the authors quote you on page 17 as saying that you would have no theological problem with a married Jesus.
No, they're liars, and I confronted them. In fact, I sent a lawyer to them about that.
And they have not taken it out of their
No, they have not taken it out of them.
One last question for me. Let's assume that John Paul does assume leadership of the world.
Moral and spiritual.
All right, you're saying moral and spiritual. Then will he be seen to be more of the geopolitical leader, or are you saying that he will be more of the spiritual leader?
Moral and spiritual. On the geopolitical plane.
So he'll be combination of both, Dr. Martin? Calling the political...
You see, Catherine, look at it like this. Take, say, President Bush in a mythical situation. He has to make a decision about prudential judgment about an action involving, say, United States money and the United States Armed Forces. Now, he has prudential reasons from the financial area and from the economic area and from the military area, reasons that impel him one way or the other and push him down one road to one decision. But intervening in that must come, as a Christian, must come his morality, his moral principles. Now, it's at that point the Pope would enter.
Okay. I guess I have one more question.
Yes.
I lied. I lied. I'm Irish. Dr.
She's very deceitful.
Kathleen, I love your questions because you've read my book, and that's the biggest flattery you can give to a poor fellow.
Dr. Martin, I read it twice, and I've read some chapters through and three times. I'm fascinated. I'm going back to a prophecy, I suppose, that Fulton J. Sheen, a beautiful man.
A lovely man.
wrote in 1948,
Yeah.
in which he very broadly hints that perhaps one of the last popes of the Catholic Church will be in league with the Antichrist.
Yes, there is that prophecy. It's a very vague prophecy, by the way. It doesn't say that a pope will be in league with Antichrist. It does suggest to some people who have an anti-Catholic prejudice anyway, by their training and their theological background and the history of the Christian church or sect they belong to, that out of Rome will come Antichrist. And they identify that with the Pope or an associate of the Pope. That is one interpretation, and for Catholics, of course, it's a wrong interpretation, and between you and me, an insulting one, too. I'm not being insulted by it, but you know what I mean.
I think in Bishop Sheen's book, however, he said the last Pope would be an apostate Pope, and he would speak from Moscow.
Yeah, there's something to that extent, all right. Now, if I could let my head down for one moment with both of you on this point, may I do that?
You may.
And very briefly, though. As far as we can see, at the present moment, the corruption of the Church, Catholic Church, the Catholic hierarchy, has gone so far. The corruption being that they no longer want to acknowledge the Petrine office of the Pope and the divine origin of the papacy. But that doctrine, that belief has spread amongst so many Catholic hierarchs, especially some cardinals, that it is within the realm of possibility they would elect somebody totally unfit to be Pope. And that is one of the fears of John Paul II at the present moment.
That's, as I read through your book, those two thoughts pegged in my brain. Number one, I believe Pope John Paul is trying to do something that he believes is morally good for the world. He's already 70 years old. That means his lifespan could conceivably go another 30 years, given good health, etc., etc. What happens if he puts in place a magnificent system here, complete with an intelligence network and global influence, and then suddenly passes on, and someone...
I know, John, it's a nightmare I have, lad. It's a nightmare, and I'm sure it's a nightmare he has too. The only thing is that when you talk to this man, you find out that his confidence and his reliance on the guidance of the Lord Jesus through his mother is so great that he lays aside his fears. But that doesn't quell my fears, I assure you, especially when I see some of the things coming out of Roman bureaucrats and out of our contemporary American Catholic bishops.
Well, I remember in your book you quoted the Latin expression de labore solus, which was one of the papal prophecies of St. Malachi.
That's right.
According to St. Malachi, we only have two popes left. The last one is Petrus Romanus, the Roman Peter.
That's right.
Do you remember what the one was for the interim pope, the one between this one and the last one?
De meditare de labore solis. Yes, I do remember. Here it is, in very briefly and in the Latin words. Hold on a moment. I have the second word. Olive. Anyway, it's the branch of the olive.
Okay.
Ramus Olive.
Interesting.
And by the way, Ramus Olive, the olive in the Bible, as Kathleen will tell you, is a symbol of Israel.
Yes.
See, most people who would be what you would call minimalists or conservative or fundamentalist or evangelical Christians are saying that as they read the scriptures, what is prophesied is a global government with which we're all in agreement here, with a very strong religious branch, but it is totally apostate and works evil upon the people who ultimately wind up remaining having belief in Jesus Christ.
I think John Paul II would agree with in general lines with that, because he doesn't foresee any easy out for us all. He does foresee a world government. He does foresee that it will either be dominated by Gorbachev's Leninism or gross capitalism in its grossest, or a combination of the two. It will be anti-Christian and anti-religious, but that at that precise moment the sign will come in the heavens and liberate men's minds and wills.
What should we make, Dr. Martin, of the fact that Mikhail Gorbachev and John Paul are both Slavic men, and that they have met twice now in a year, I believe, and that is there some possibility these two will form a coalition of some sort?
No, I think they're doing what two great geopolitical men would always do. In other words, establish relationships with each other, watch each other very carefully, John Paul II pursuing him with prayer and sacrifices to obtain the grace of God, so that he revived his Christian faith, because up to the age of 15, Michael Gorbachev stood every week between his parents and sang the old Slavonic hymns, and every Easter he received the body and blood of Jesus in his church in Privolnaya, his native city.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, Mikhail Gorbachev, being the clever man he is, would like to utilize the Pope's influence. He's already got that influence to help him calm the Catholics in the Ukraine and the Catholics in Belarusia and the Catholics in the Baltic countries. And John Paul II would go along with that, not as a means of fomenting Gorbachev and Gorbachevism, but as a means of entering into the heart of the Russian heartland.
Okay.
It's a dangerous game, Kathleen.
Yes, well,
it's a very dangerous game.
I would say so.
I'm desperately holding my breath because my fear is what's going to happen is exactly what we're talking about.
I know. Mine is too. And then I must also add another thing in for your mind's consumption, and it's this. There is at the present moment a terrible pressure on John Paul II to resign. Why? Because, as you know, the law of the Catholic Church is that at the age of 75, every bishop should resign, and the Pope is a bishop. Primarily, he's the Bishop of Rome and primate of the whole Church. Now, the pressure is on him to resign at the age of 75 because the Church is so disunited under him. And that, of course, pressure comes from those who would like to see the abolition of the papacy. And they have succeeded to a certain degree to abolish the papacy in this sense that they have prevailed on him not to exercise his absolute monarchical power, which he has by office.
Dr. Martin,
where I'm going?
Yes.
Dr. Martin, we have to take a quick break, and we'll be back for the last 15 minutes of the program. This is Steel on Steel. To many Christians in America, discussions about the New Age, creationism versus evolution, and the occult may seem like old hat. But to people in Latin America, it's still news, the good news, because they haven't had a chance to hear the issues. This is due to the fact that the abundance of written and audiovisual material on these subjects, which exists in English, is not available in Spanish. The Latin American Broadcasting Corporation is working to change all of that by translating currently available material into Spanish or creating new literature where required. In addition, LABC is reproducing English-language videos with Spanish-language soundtracks for distribution in the countries of Latin America. Usually any person can make an intelligent decision if they have all of the information they need to make that decision. Your support of the Latin American Broadcasting Corporation will see that Spanish-speaking Christians in Latin America have that information and the good news that Jesus is coming. Contributions may be sent to LABC, P.O. Box 1763, Boulder, Colorado 80306. Once again, Latin American Broadcast Corporation, Box 1763, Boulder, Colorado 80306. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. I'm John Leffler. With me is Kathleen Hayes, and we are interviewing Dr. Malachi Martin, who is author of Keys of This Blood. Now, did either of you have a point to make? Kathleen, did you?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask, Dr. Martin, let us assume that John Paul does take control of the planet. What will be the form of government he will lead? From the things I've read that John Paul has said at the United Nations, the things he has said in various parts of the world, his very much of an interest in syncretism and bringing all religions together under one umbrella, leads me to think that he will lead a government whose form is socialism.
No, Kathleen, I say that politely. I don't say it sort of abruptly like that. No, he's not in favor of socialism.
But he's not in favor of capitalism. So what will be the form of government?
Well, he hasn't elaborated on that to any great extent, but I know this much, that the first thing he requires would be the elimination of sinful structures, as he calls it, both in capitalism and any other form of government, socialism included. By sinful structures, he means those structures set up by men who have set them up purely and simply to make money. Because we know that at the present moment, because of those structures, mainly in the capitalist West, but certainly also and mainly, put it like that, in Gorbachev's Leninist world, those structures have produced misery and homelessness and torture and hunger and famine, and those must be eliminated. I think that John Paul II, after that, it would leave the elaboration of the world government to to those who are capable of producing the prudential judgments necessary to organize the economy of the world for the good of all men and not for one particular segment of it. So he hasn't elaborated on that, because that will not be his job, Kathleen. His job will be to point out the moral and religious elements. He's not going either for syncretism. He does acknowledge what is good in all religions besides his Roman Catholicism. But he does say that whatever is good in them is inspired by the same Holy Spirit that created the Roman Catholic Church.
Of course, you know that a lot of the rebel factions, so to speak, in the Catholic Church are urging exactly this kind of an amalgamated syncretism. This is what the entire New Age movement is all about.
That's
and
right.
I hear priests, if I go to a Catholic church, even here in Denver, I can hear priests preaching on this subject.
I know, but one thing I always say about them, John, you may not necessarily say it, when they do that, they have lost their Catholic faith. They've gone over to some other side.
That's true, but that's not going to change the impact of what they have. And see, I had the same argument one time with my mother. We were talking about the Catholic Church being the true church descended from Peter due to Petrine and apostolic authority and the lineage there. And my point was, is if millions of people fall into hell, of what use is a line from Peter?
Well, you know, John, one basic and rather, for me, always a frightening fact is that God nowhere promises that all will be saved. De facto, he has provided salvation for all men, but the clear indication in the Bible and in the words of the Lord Jesus himself is that some will not be saved. After all, at one stage he pictured himself saying on the last day, "Depart from me, ye cursed," into everlasting flame. So we have no surety whatever. In fact, the whole burden of Christian revelation and tradition is that not all will be saved, although all can be saved.
But see, to follow up the point, I agree with what you're saying, is the fact that there are several places in Scripture where God calls down a heavy burden on prophets and pastors who don't do what they were told to do.
Absolutely right.
And God says, these people will be lost and it's on their own heads, but I'm going to hold you accountable for it.
That's right, and he will. And because they have provided scandal, a real scandal in the biblical sense of the word, scandal being a loss of faith through the actions I perform in front of others that lose their faith on that account. But those, I have no doubt in my mind, John and Kathleen, that the number of the elect will be restricted. It's Christian tradition as well as Catholic tradition. The behavior of our priests going over to the New Age, becoming completely immersed in non-Christian and non-Catholic things, I take as a sign of the disappearance of faith from the face of the earth, which is one of the things predicted in the last days by the Bible.
That's correct.
Dr. Martin, there seems to be a contradiction, though.
Yes.
When I talked to you earlier, and in some of the information I received that you sent me, you claim that John Paul is going to reestablish some kind of spiritual I don't know what maybe structure within the new formed church when he assumes power, based on the teaching of the last four popes. But the teaching of the last four popes has made it the liberal church it is now. Isn't that a contradiction?
Well, Kathleen, John Paul II's aim is to obey the dictates of heaven when that revelation comes. Those last, not four popes actually. There's John Paul I before him, and then Paul VI, and then John the 23rd. Were all men caught on the rim of two worlds. And now, any dispassionate judgment on John the 23rd and Paul VI above all, on John Paul I, he only reigned for 34 days, it's very hard to say. But certainly on John the 23rd and Paul VI, was that they did not see what was happening, and that they allowed things happen which are brought us to the present
you believe that they were innocent then of what was going on?
They were, pardon what?
They were innocent of what was happening around them?
They were innocent in the sense that they didn't see, but only God can judge if they are responsible for what they allowed happen. Do you understand me? I mean, time and time again, Paul VI raved and ranted about those who had misinterpreted his words and interpreted them in a liberal sense that destroyed Catholic meaning.
But, this swings us back to the same fear we talked about 10 minutes ago, and that is, in having read almost all of your books on this subject, the Vatican seems to be a machine which is only somewhat under papal control.
That's right. And at the present moment, he has 15 ministries in the Vatican, 1.5 obey him.
Yeah, 1.5. There is Masonry, Freemasonry has moved into the Vatican, has it not?
Yes, it has. And into the hierarchy. Look, we can sum it all up, and everybody who is in the know and who has examined it will agree the structure of the church, the administrative functional structure of the Roman Catholic Church is in shambles. It is no longer acting in a Catholic way.
Then
That is our big difficulty.
How many Catholics know that?
Very few know it. A lot suspect it
yes.
because of what they see going on around them.
See, I think a lot of the problem is when their Protestant brothers and sisters come to them and say, look at what's going on in your church, they knee-jerk react and say, well, that's just Protestants critiquing Catholicism.
That's typical, and it's wrong. They should say no. And then we have this horrible thing amongst our clergy, especially our bishops. They try to cover things up. They will not let the sun shine on the evils within us. And take one small point. This year alone, I'm given a ballpark figure. I can't verify it, but I'm inclined to accept it. The church in America will pay out at least $95 million in out-of-court settlements for priestly pedophilia.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot of money. And the major insurance carriers in the United States have refused to insure dioceses against suits brought against them by parents whose children have been violated by priests.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of stories that we've heard even from adults who previously had problems when they were younger with priests or nuns.
Oh, yes. This is one of the big difficulties. However, I must tell you both, John and Kathleen, that it's a running sore. It's a cancer at the present moment in the Catholic Church. By the way, it's also a cancer in the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church, but that's something else. We're talking about the Catholic Church. Let's stay confined to that. But I don't think it's the main issue at stake. I think the main issue at stake, what has broken the structure, is the absolute rejection of papal authority.
Well, if that's true, though, Dr. Martin, then what will prevent that from happening once John Paul assumes authority of the world? That same kind of contamination can happen there.
I know, Kathleen, but at that stage we presume that the sign of the heavens has come and infallibly revealed to all men where they stand.
Though Jesus warned us against signs.
Well, I don't know. Signs are very useful things, provided you can make out if it's a sign from God or a sign from the devil.
And I think that's a very real issue, Dr. Martin, because you're going to find many Protestants who will, if this vision is to occur, let's say next week or in a month, and if they see this vision, I, for one, will not believe it is from God, based on what the Lord Jesus Christ said.
Apparently, the sign is so potent that you will have to.
Well, but the devil is quite potent,
and
too.
Jesus said signs and wonders so powerful as to deceive even the elect.
I know, but this particular sign John Paul II is looking for will be such a kind that your own conscience will scream out, this is God.
And yet, though, Dr. Martin, he says he's gambling everything on this sign. Why gamble? If it's from God, there's no gamble involved.
No, when I say he's gambling everything, he's not doing anything about the shambles of his church. He's waiting for this sign. He's gambling that it will hold. You see, the difficulty is, as you read in the scenario at the end of the book, Kathleen, is this. At any given moment, John Paul II may look over his shoulder and find out the diminished crowd following him. How far will it diminish? God only knows. That's the gamble he's taking, that it's diminishing every year. That's the gamble. Just as Michael Gorbachev is taking a gamble that he's flirting with and tampering with capitalism will not destroy his Leninism. It's the gamble he takes. And we're taking a gamble in the West, we capitalists, because we're spreading ourselves thin, and we're relying on the power of money and capitalist production powers to heal the world of a spiritual disease.
Dr. Martin, we're down to 3 minutes. You said you're writing a predictive book, and I'm running out of reading material. What is this going to, what is this going to be about?
It's going to be about the last phase, the last act, the last phase in John Paul II's life as Pope.
Yeah, but it's in a predictive nature, like here's where we think it's going.
Predictive nature, yes. And by the way, John, to make you both and Kathleen laugh, it will be a faction.
A contentious faction or a pleasant one?
Oh, it'll be a pleasant one. It'll be full of light and joy and cheerio and that sort of business, and nice characters and nice people who get married and have babies and find their way through the thicket and the thorns of this life's beauties and this life's ugliness.
As we all follow the yellow brick road, right?
Dr. Martin, one very quick question.
Yes.
I know this time is running down. Assuming John Paul does assume leadership of the planet,
yes,
will there be a pope, or will he be the last pope of the Catholic Church?
May I put it sort of, it may sound enigmatic, but I really mean what I'm saying. He's the last pope of these Catholic times.
Okay.
That's a very good statement. If you would stay on the line, I need to talk to you after we get off
Sure.
the air.
Kathleen, thank you very much for being
Thank
there.
you, Dr. Martin.
For anyone who is listening today who would like to have a copy of the broadcast, you may call 940-0604. That's 940-0604. If you would like a copy of the Trumpet newsletter that Kathleen produces, you may call that number as well, and we'll get some information to you. If you're outside the Denver metro area, you may use 1-800-829-5646. 1-800-829-5646. I'm John Leffler. This has been Steel on Steel, a weekly broadcast dedicated to the sharpening of ideas. My guest interviewer today has been Kathleen Hayes, who is the publisher of the Trumpet newsletter, and our guest for interview has been Dr. Malachi Martin, author of The Keys of This Blood, The Struggle for World Dominion Between Pope John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the Capitalist West. We will be back again next week with another topic. Steel on Steel is a presentation of Steel on Steel Productions. The program does not necessarily represent the views of KLTT's staff or management. Good day.